Hey there, night owls! Tonight we're talking about 70 years that changed everything, the rise and fall of the Soviet Union. From a bloody civil war in 1922 to that final moment on December 31st, 1991, when the red flag came down for the last time over the Kremlin. This is the story of the largest country ever to exist, built on revolutionary dreams and held together by iron fists, gulags, and the kind of political paranoia that would make your average thriller look like a bedtime story. Before we dive in, hit that like button if you're ready for this deep dive and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from right now? I'm genuinely curious who's joining me for this journey through one of history's most controversial experiments. Now go ahead, turn down those lights, get comfortable, and let's walk through the complete history of the USSR. From Lenin's revolutionary blueprint to Gorbachev's accidental dismantling of an empire. This is going to be one hell of a ride through superpower politics, nuclear standoffs, and the slow-motion collapse of an ideology. Ready? Let's begin. Picture this. It's December 30th, 1922. Russia isn't Russia anymore, at least not in the way anyone would recognize it. The Russian Empire, that massive sprawling beast that had ruled for centuries, is gone. Obliterated. In its place, something entirely new is being assembled from the wreckage of civil war, famine, and revolutionary chaos. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, comes into being not with celebration, but with exhaustion. 5 years of civil war have just ended. Millions are dead. Cities are starving. The economy is shattered. And yet somehow the Bolsheviks, Lenin's revolutionary party, have won. They've defeated the White Armies, the foreign interventionists, the anarchists, and every other faction that tried to tear them down. Lenin himself is the architect of this new creation, though by 1922 he's already dealing with the strokes that will kill him within 2 years. But his vision is clear. Take the old empire, strip away the monarchy and capitalism, and rebuild it as a federation of socialist republics. Each major ethnic group gets its own republic. Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Georgians, Armenians, Azerbaijanis. On paper, it looks like respect for national identity. In practice, it's a clever way to manage an empire without calling it an empire. The formation document is signed. 4 founding republics, Russian SFSR, Ukrainian SSR, Belarusian SSR, and the Transcaucasian SFSR, officially merge. More will join later. The structure is federal, meaning each republic theoretically has autonomy. The reality? Moscow calls the shots. The Communist Party controls everything. Lenin's brilliance was understanding that you could give people the appearance of self-determination while maintaining absolute central control. This isn't just a new country. It's an ideological experiment on a scale never attempted before. The Bolsheviks believe they're creating the template for humanity's future. A workers' paradise where class distinctions disappear, where production is planned scientifically, where exploitation becomes impossible. Other countries will follow their example, they think. Revolution will spread across Europe, then the world. The US, of course, reality has other plans. To understand what the USSR actually represented, you need to back up a few years. The Russian Empire didn't just fade away politely. It imploded in spectacular fashion during World War I, when millions of peasant soldiers died in trenches while the Tsar's government proved itself completely incompetent at the basic tasks of running a modern war. The February Revolution of 1917 swept away the monarchy. For a few months, Russia tried liberal democracy under the provisional government. It didn't take. By October, Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized power in Petrograd with surprising ease. Turns out peace, land, and bread is a pretty compelling platform when you're offering it to people who have none of those things. But winning power in the capital didn't mean controlling the country. What followed was a civil war so brutal and chaotic that it makes most conflicts look organized by comparison. The Reds, Bolsheviks, fought the Whites, everyone from monarchists to liberals to moderate socialists. Foreign armies invaded, British, French, American, Japanese, trying to strangle the revolution in its cradle. Peasant armies carved out their own territories. Entire regions descended into banditry and warlordism. Through it all, the Bolsheviks survived by being more ruthless, more organized, and more willing to use terror than anyone else. They militarized the economy, requisitioned grain from peasants at gunpoint, and created the Cheka, the secret police that would eventually evolve into the KGB. When the Civil War ended in 1922, the Bolsheviks controlled more or less the same territory the old empire had held, minus Poland, Finland, and the Baltic states. So the USSR was born from violence and built on the ruins of the old world. Lenin's genius was selling this as liberation rather than conquest. The new constitution proclaimed equality for all nationalities, the right to self-determination, even the theoretical right to secede. None of this meant much in practice, but it created a useful fiction that the USSR was fundamentally different from the empire it replaced. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, born Ulyanov, was the indispensable man. Without him, there probably wouldn't have been a Soviet Union. He combined a lawyer's precision with a revolutionary's ruthlessness, adding in just enough theoretical sophistication to make it all seem inevitable rather than improvised. His background was professional class. His father was a school inspector who earned a minor noble title. But after his older brother was executed for plotting to assassinate the Tsar, Lenin dedicated himself to revolutionary politics. He studied Marx obsessively, adapted Marxist theory to Russian conditions, and spent years in exile building a disciplined revolutionary party. What made Lenin different from other revolutionaries was his absolutely unshakable conviction that he was right about everything. Other Marxists thought Russia needed to develop capitalism first, then transition to socialism. Lenin said no, Russia could skip straight to socialism if the right party with the right consciousness seized the moment. Other revolutionaries worried about alienating potential allies. Lenin said the revolution needed a vanguard party of professional revolutionaries who wouldn't compromise with bourgeois democracy. He was also willing to be breathtakingly pragmatic when dogma didn't serve his purposes. After the Civil War devastated the economy, he implemented the New Economic Policy, NEP, which basically reintroduced limited capitalism. Private trade, small businesses, foreign investment, all the things Bolsheviks had spent years denouncing. Lenin sold this as a strategic retreat, a temporary measure to rebuild the economy before resuming the march to socialism. The NEP worked. By the mid-1920s, production was recovering. Cities were functioning again, but it also created a contradiction at the heart of the Soviet project. How do you build socialism using capitalist methods? How long is temporary supposed to last? These questions would define Soviet politics for the next decade. By the time the USSR was officially formed, Lenin was already dying. His first stroke came in May 1922. More followed. He spent his final months dictating notes and letters, increasingly alarmed at what he saw developing. Stalin was accumulating too much power as general secretary. The party was becoming bureaucratic and authoritarian. National tensions were emerging between the republics. In his political testament, a document that was suppressed after his death, Lenin warned that Stalin was too rude and capricious to be trusted with power and should be removed as general secretary. The warning went unheeded. Lenin died on January 21, 1924. His body was embalmed and put on display in a mausoleum in Red Square, where it remains to this day, a bizarre monument to a man who probably would have found the whole cult of his personality deeply embarrassing. But that cult would prove useful for his successors, particularly for the one who would transform Lenin's revolutionary experiment into something far darker and more totalitarian. The USSR that Lenin left behind in 1924 was fragile, exhausted, and surrounded by hostile capitalist powers. It had survived against incredible odds, but whether it could actually build the socialist paradise Lenin envisioned was an entirely different question. That question would be answered over the next 7 decades, though probably not in the way Lenin hoped. The Soviet experiment was beginning. What came next would reshape the 20th century and cast shadows that still fall across our world today. This was just the opening act. So the USSR exists now. Congratulations to Lenin and his exhausted revolutionaries. They've managed to glue together the remnants of a shattered empire and call it a socialist federation. But here's the thing about gluing empires back together. The pieces don't always want to stick. And when those pieces are dozens of different ethnic groups who've spent centuries resenting Russian domination, well, you've got yourself what the Bolsheviks delicately called the national question. The national question was basically this. How do you run a massive multi-ethnic state without looking like you're running a massive multi-ethnic state? The old Russian Empire had a simple solution: Russification. Learn Russian, adopt Russian culture, worship in Russian Orthodox churches, and maybe we won't send Cossacks to burn down your village. Not exactly a customer satisfaction approach that builds loyalty. Lenin, to his credit, understood that this wouldn't fly in a supposedly egalitarian socialist state. You couldn't very well proclaim the liberation of all peoples while forcing Ukrainians and Georgians and Kazakhs to abandon their languages and cultures. That would be imperialism with a red flag instead of a tricolour one. So the Bolsheviks needed something cleverer. a way to acknowledge national identities while maintaining absolute political control from Moscow. Their solution was the federal structure of the USSR, and it was both ingenious and completely contradictory. The basic concept was this: create a union of Soviet socialist republics where each major nationality got its own republic with its own government, its own language, its own cultural institutions. On paper, these republics were sovereign entities that had voluntarily joined together in socialist brotherhood. They even had the constitutional right to secede, which was like giving someone a parachute with no ripcord. Technically there, functionally useless. The founding treaty of December 1922 established 4 republics: the Russian SFSR, which was by far the largest, the Ukrainian SSR, the Belarusian SSR, and the Transcaucasian SFSR, which was itself a federation of Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan, because apparently the Bolsheviks thought the Caucasus needed extra layers of bureaucratic complexity, as if the region wasn't complicated enough already. More republics would be added over the years. The Transcaucasian SFSR would eventually be split into separate Armenian, Georgian, and Azerbaijani republics in 1936, probably after someone in Moscow finally looked at a map and realized that mashing together 3 distinct nations with different languages, religions, and historical grievances wasn't the administrative shortcut they'd imagined. The Central Asian republics, Uzbek, Kazakh, Kyrgyz, Tajik, Turkmen, would be carved out of what had been Russian Turkestan, though the borders were drawn with the kind of thoughtful consideration you'd expect from bureaucrats using rulers and ethnic surveys that were, let's say, optimistic about their accuracy. The whole structure was meant to embody what Stalin, who was ironically the Commissar for Nationalities despite being Georgian, called national in form, socialist in content. Each republic could celebrate its national culture, publish books in its native language, promote its folk traditions, as long as the content was appropriately socialist and didn't question who actually held power. It was like being allowed to decorate your apartment however you wanted, as long as the landlord could walk in any time and change everything if he didn't like your choices. But here's by creating these republics along ethnic lines, by giving them governments and borders and national identities, the Bolsheviks were essentially building the framework for the USSR's eventual dissolution. They were creating nations where, in many cases, strong national consciousness hadn't existed before. It's like building your house with prefabricated demolition charges installed in the walls, convenient for construction, problematic for long-term stability. Lenin understood some of this danger. By 1922, he was increasingly worried about what he called Great Russian Chauvinism, the tendency of Russian Bolsheviks to treat non-Russian peoples as backward children who needed Moscow's guidance. He argued for genuine federal autonomy, for real power sharing, for allowing the republics to develop their own paths to socialism within the broader Union framework. Stalin disagreed. Strongly. Stalin's vision was far more centralized. He wanted the republics to be administrative units within a unified state, basically provinces with fancy titles. The debate between Stalin and Lenin over the structure of the USSR was one of the most significant theoretical disputes in early Soviet history, though you wouldn't know it from Soviet textbooks, which had a habit of memory-holing inconvenient disagreements. The conflict came to a head over Georgia, Stalin's homeland, ironically. In 1922, Georgian Bolsheviks were pushing back against forced incorporation into the Transcaucasian Federation. They wanted to be a separate Union republic, which was reasonable given that Georgia had its own distinct language, culture, and history. Stalin, running the nationalities policy, basically told them to shut up and accept Moscow's decision. When they complained to Lenin, and Lenin supported the Georgians, Stalin allegedly called Lenin's wife Krupskaya and cursed her out over the phone, which is not typically how you maintain good relations with your dying leader. Lenin was furious. In one of his last political letters, he wrote that Stalin had acted like a great Russian bully and needed to be removed from his position of power. This was in December 1922, right as the USSR was being formed. Lenin wanted a federation with genuine autonomy for the republics. Stalin wanted an empire with socialist branding. Guess which vision won after Lenin died? The federal structure that emerged was a beautiful piece of political theatre. Each republic had its own Supreme Soviet, essentially a parliament, its own council of ministers, its own constitution. The USSR as a whole had an all-union government with a Supreme Soviet made up of 2 chambers, the Soviet of the Union and the Soviet of Nationalities. The Soviet of Nationalities was supposed to give smaller republics equal voice regardless of population size, sort of like the US Senate, except without any of the actual power that might make equal representation meaningful. Because here's the catch, and it's a big one. None of these governmental structures actually mattered. The real power wasn't in the Soviets or the councils or the constitutions. It was in the Communist Party. And the Communist Party was not federal. It was a single, unified, hierarchical organization controlled from Moscow. Every republic had its own Communist Party branch, but those branches answered to the Central Committee in Moscow. The General Secretary of the Communist Party, a position that seemed minor in 1922 but would become the most powerful office in the Soviet Union, controlled everything through party discipline. So you could have all the Republican governments you wanted, complete with flags and anthems and elaborate ceremonies, but if the party said jump, everyone jumped in unison, from Vladivostok to Minsk. It was like having an elaborate democracy where everything was decided by a secret committee that nobody elected and nobody could challenge. Which, come to think of it, is exactly what it was. The republics did get some genuine concessions. Ukrainian became the official language in Ukraine, with Ukrainian language schools, newspapers, universities. This was called indigenization, or korenizatsiya, the policy of promoting local cadres and local languages. For a while in the 1920s, Ukrainian culture actually flourished in ways it hadn't under the Russian Empire. Same with Belarusian culture, Central Asian cultures, even smaller ethnic groups got their own autonomous regions and cultural institutions. But this cultural flourishing existed within very specific limits. You could write poetry in Ukrainian about the glories of collective farming. You couldn't write poetry in Ukrainian questioning whether collective farming was actually a good idea. You could publish Kazakh language newspapers praising Soviet power. You couldn't publish Kazakh language newspapers suggesting that maybe Central Asians should run their own affairs without Russian advisors looking over their shoulders. And those Russian advisors were everywhere. In theory, each republic was run by local leaders. In practice, those local leaders were party members whose careers depended on Moscow's approval. The local Communist Party secretary might be ethnically Ukrainian or Georgian, but he'd been trained in Moscow, spoke Russian fluently, and understood that his job was implementing Moscow's policies, not representing local interests. If he got confused about whose interest came first, he'd be replaced with someone who understood the assignment better. The federal structure also created some genuinely bizarre situations. Because republics were nominally sovereign, they each had their own foreign commissariats, basically foreign ministries. For a brief period in the 1920s, Ukraine and Belarus had their own seats at international organizations, their own diplomatic services, their own representatives abroad. This was useful for the USSR because it meant they got 3 votes instead of 1 at various international bodies. It was less useful for anyone taking the idea of republican sovereignty seriously, since Ukrainian and Belarusian foreign policy consisted entirely of doing whatever Moscow told them to do, which rather undermined the point of having separate foreign policies. The smaller nationalities got autonomous republics or autonomous regions within the larger Union republics, a whole complicated hierarchy of federal units that someone in Moscow had clearly spent way too much time designing. You had Union republics, autonomous oblasts, autonomous okrugs, and probably a few other categories I'm forgetting. Each level had slightly different rights and responsibilities, though again, none of it mattered much since the party controlled everything anyway. The logic behind these autonomous regions was that they were too small or too scattered to be full Union republics, but their population still deserved some recognition of their distinct identity. So you got things like the Tatar Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic within the Russian SFSR, or the Karakalpak Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic within the Uzbek SSR, or the Nakhchivan Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic within the Azerbaijani SSR. It was like Russian nesting dolls, except instead of dolls, it was ethnicities, and instead of nesting peacefully, they were engaged in complex bureaucratic relationships that would create territorial disputes lasting decades. Some of these borders made sense. Others were drawn with what appears to have been a deliberate attempt to create ethnic mixing and prevent any single group from becoming too unified. Take or South Ossetia and Abkhazia, given to Georgia despite their populations having complicated relationships with Georgian rule. These weren't accidents. Stalin, as Commissar for Nationalities, understood that ethnic tensions could be useful for maintaining control. Groups busy arguing with each other about provincial boundaries weren't organizing against Moscow. The federal system also created a new class of national elites in each republic. Before the revolution, most local elites in places like Central Asia or the Caucasus had been either traditional, Khans, beys, religious leaders, or Russian colonial administrators. The Bolsheviks wiped out the traditional elites and replaced the Russian colonials with new Soviet-trained local cadres. These people, often young, educated in Soviet schools, fluent in Marxist-Leninist theory, became the Republican Communist Party leadership. This was supposed to solve the national question by putting locals in charge of local affairs. In practice, it created a new problem. These local elites developed their own interests and power bases. They might be Communist Party members loyal to Moscow in theory, but they were also Uzbeks or Kazakhs or Ukrainians with connections to their local communities. They could be incredibly useful to Moscow as intermediaries who made Soviet rule palatable to local populations. They could also become obstacles if they started taking the national inform part too seriously and forgot about the socialist in content part. During the 1920s, this whole federal experiment seemed to be working reasonably well, at least by the standards of keeping a massive multi-ethnic state from falling apart. The republics had some genuine autonomy in cultural affairs. Local languages flourished. Nationally, the Soviet Union looked, at least superficially, like it had solved the problem that had destroyed the Russian Empire: how to govern diverse peoples without constant rebellion and repression. Of course, this apparent success rested on some shaky foundations. The republic's autonomy existed because Moscow allowed it to exist. The moment Moscow decided that national autonomy was threatening central control, that autonomy would vanish. The federal structure didn't limit the central government's power. It just provided a convenient fiction that made imperial control more palatable. And the person who understood this better than anyone, who had designed much of the system and knew exactly how to manipulate it, was quietly accumulating power in Moscow. His name was Joseph Stalin, and he was about to demonstrate that the USSR's federal structure was only as strong as the person controlling it chose to let it be. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how Stalin transformed Lenin's federal experiment into something far more centralized and brutal, we need to talk about the succession struggle that followed Lenin's death. Because the national question and the question of who would rule the USSR became intimately connected, and the way Stalin solved both problems would define Soviet politics for decades. The federal structure of the USSR, this elaborate system of republics and autonomies and constitutional guarantees, would remain in place right up until 1991. It would survive Stalin's purges, World War II, the Cold War, everything. And then, when the Soviet Union finally collapsed, it would collapse along exactly the lines the Bolsheviks had drawn in 1922. The Union republics that Lenin and Stalin had created, partly as window dressing and partly as administrative convenience, would become the borders of independent nations. The federal experiment that was designed to hold the empire together would end up providing the blueprint for its dissolution. But that was 70 years away. In the 1920s, the USSR was still new, still finding its footing, still figuring out what kind of state it wanted to be. The federal structure was one answer to that question. The succession struggle was about to pose a different, more immediate question. Not what kind of state the USSR would be, but who would control it. Lenin died on January 21, 1924, at 6:50 in the evening in Gorky, a village outside Moscow where he'd been convalescing since his last stroke. He was 53 years old. His brain had been ravaged by repeated strokes. Doctors would later find it had severely atrophied, which raises interesting questions about how much of late Lenin's political judgment was actually Lenin and how much was his brain trying to function with rapidly dying tissue. But those questions are uncomfortable for Soviet hagiography, so they largely got ignored. What followed Lenin's death was one of the most consequential leadership transitions in modern history, though it didn't look particularly consequential at the time. There was no dramatic coup, no assassination, no civil war, just several years of bureaucratic maneuvering, political alliance building, and the gradual elimination of everyone who might pose a threat to Stalin's control. It was like watching someone win a game of chess by slowly removing every piece from the board except his own, and doing it so methodically that his opponents didn't realize they'd lost until checkmate. The conventional narrative is that there was a power struggle between Trotsky and Stalin for Lenin's succession, and Stalin won. This is true, but it's also wildly oversimplified. The reality was more like a multilateral political knife fight involving half a dozen ambitious Bolsheviks, each with their own power base, their own vision for the USSR's future, and their own fatal underestimation of Stalin's political skills. Let's start with the main characters, because Soviet politics in the 1920s reads like a particularly grim novel where everyone's tragic flaw is thinking they're smarter than the guy in the middle. First, Leon Trotsky. Trotsky was brilliant, charismatic, and absolutely convinced of his own genius, which was only partly justified, though the partly justified part was significant. He'd organized the Red Army during the Civil War, turning peasant conscripts into a fighting force that defeated the white armies against considerable odds. He was a gifted orator, a prolific writer, and the second most famous Bolshevik after Lenin. He was also arrogant, dismissive of party politics, and surprisingly naive about how power actually worked. Trotsky believed that intellectual superiority and revolutionary credentials would naturally translate into political leadership. This was approximately as realistic as expecting your PhD to help you survive a street fight. He'd spent the Civil War years building military power but ignoring party organization, which meant he had plenty of people who admired him and almost nobody who owed him their career. In Bolshevik politics, the second thing mattered more than the first. Then there was Grigory Zinoviev, head of the Comintern, the Communist International and party boss of Leningrad. Zinoviev, he was a talented propagandist and a capable organizer, though he had a reputation for physical cowardice that dated back to 1917, when he and Lev Kamenev had publicly opposed Lenin's plan for armed insurrection, which is not the kind of thing that ages well when the insurrection succeeds and becomes the founding myth of your state. Lev Kamenev, Zinoviev's close ally, was head of the Moscow Party organization and chairman of the Council of Labor and Defense. He was intellectual, moderate, and completely outmaneuvered at every turn. Kamenev was the kind of guy who brings sophisticated policy arguments to a political brawl, which tells you how his story ends. Nikolai Bukharin was the party's leading theorist, editor of Pravda, and the closest thing the Bolsheviks had to an economic thinker who understood that maybe starving peasants to death wasn't optimal policy. He was genuinely beloved by many party members, probably the most personally likable of the top leadership. Lenin called him the favourite of the whole party, which would have been more helpful if Lenin had also arranged for Bukharin to have actual institutional power rather than just popularity. And then there was Stalin. Joseph Stalin, born Yosef Jugashvili in Georgia, former seminary student turned revolutionary, veteran of Siberian exile and underground party work. In 1924, Stalin held an office that most people, including most Bolsheviks, considered largely administrative, General Secretary of the Communist Party. The General Secretary was supposed to manage party bureaucracy, handle appointments, coordinate between different party organs. Not exactly the glamorous revolutionary vanguard stuff that guys like Trotsky spent their time on. But Stalin understood something that his more brilliant colleagues missed. In a one-party state, controlling the party bureaucracy meant controlling everything. The General Secretary decided who got promoted to party positions. The General Secretary decided which party members got sent to which regions. The General Secretary controlled the staff that prepared Central Committee meetings, that drafted resolutions, that decided what got discussed and what got buried in paperwork. It was like being the IT administrator for a company where everyone else is focused on big strategic decisions. Sure, the executives are talking about market share and quarterly earnings, but you're the one who controls everyone's email access, and it turns out that matters more than they think. Stalin had been appointed General Secretary in 1922, when the position seemed like a way to handle tedious organizational work so that important people could focus on important things. Lenin had supported the appointment. By 1923, when Lenin was having second thoughts, it was too late. Stalin had spent a year systematically placing his allies in key positions throughout the party apparatus. The bureaucratic machine was increasingly filled with people who owed their careers to Stalin, who looked to Stalin for direction, who understood that Stalin's approval was essential for their advancement. The succession struggle began even before Lenin died. In his final months, Lenin dictated several notes and letters that became known as his testament. In them, he assessed the top Bolshevik leaders and their suitability for leadership. It's worth quoting part of it, because it's one of those historical documents where you can practically hear the dying man trying desperately to get everyone to pay attention to the obvious danger. On Stalin, Lenin wrote, "Comrade Stalin, having become General Secretary, has concentrated enormous power in his hands, and I am not sure that he always knows how to use that power with sufficient caution." Then, in a postscript added days later, "Stalin is too rude, and this defect, though quite tolerable in our midst and in relations among us communists, becomes intolerable in the position of General Secretary. I propose that the comrades find a way to remove Stalin from that position and appoint another man." On Trotsky, the most able man in the present Central Committee, but also distinguished by his too far-reaching self-confidence and a disposition to be too much attracted by the purely administrative side of affairs. On Zinoviev and Kamenev, Lenin reminded everyone that they'd opposed the October Revolution, and that episode ought not to be held against them personally any more than the non-Bolshevism of Trotsky ought to be held against him. It was the political equivalent of a dying parent trying to tell their kids that one sibling is going to screw over everyone else, and really, truly, you need to watch out for him. Unsurprisingly, nobody listened properly. The testament was supposed to be read to the party congress after Lenin's death. Stalin managed to suppress it, or rather, to have it read in limited circulation and then argue that the party shouldn't air its dirty laundry by making it public. This required Stalin to have enough control over party proceedings to manage the agenda, which he did, because he'd been placing his people everywhere that mattered. But even without the testament being widely publicized, everyone knew Lenin had turned against Stalin toward the end. Everyone knew Lenin had called Stalin crude and dangerous. And yet, here's what happened. Zinoviev and Kamenev hated Trotsky. They hated him for his arrogance, for his fame, for his revolutionary prestige, for being an ex-Menshevik who'd only joined the Bolsheviks in 1917 and still acted like he was Lenin's natural heir. They saw Trotsky as the main threat. Stalin positioned himself as the moderate centre, the practical organiser, the guy who wasn't trying to be a revolutionary superstar but just wanted to do the work of building socialism. So Zinoviev, Kamenev and Stalin formed what came to be called the Triumvirate. Together, they controlled the Central Committee. Together, they marginalised Trotsky. The fact that Stalin was the one Lenin had explicitly warned against didn't seem to bother them much, probably because they thought they could control him. Zinoviev ran Leningrad. Kamenev ran Moscow. Stalin just ran the boring bureaucracy stuff. What could go wrong? Everything, it turns out. The first major battle was over what the Soviet Union should actually do now that it existed. This got framed as a debate over socialism in one country versus permanent revolution, which sounds theoretical but had enormous practical implications. Trotsky's position was permanent revolution. The USSR couldn't build socialism in isolation, surrounded by hostile capitalist powers. Until that happened, the Soviet Union was basically just waiting for capitalism to crush it. This was orthodox Marxist theory. Socialism was supposed to come to advanced industrial economies, not backward agrarian ones like Russia. The Bolsheviks had always assumed the Russian Revolution would spark revolutions elsewhere, particularly in Germany. The problem was that by 1924 it was increasingly clear that revolution wasn't coming to Germany or anywhere else in the near term. The German workers in France and Britain showed no interest in overthrowing their governments. The hoped-for world revolution was looking more like wishful thinking with each passing year. Stalin's position was socialism in one country. The Soviet Union could and should build socialism on its own, without waiting for revolution elsewhere. This was theoretically dubious. Marx would have found it bizarre, but politically brilliant. It told party members and ordinary Soviet citizens that their sacrifices had meaning, that they could create a socialist society right now rather than hoping for Germans to rescue them. It was nationalist in its emotional appeal, even though nationalism was supposedly something communists had transcended. More importantly, socialism in one country required massive state power to industrialize the Soviet Union, to collectivize agriculture, to mobilize resources. It required exactly the kind of centralized control that Stalin was building through the party apparatus. Permanent revolution, by contrast, required focusing on international agitation and being more flexible domestically, not exactly Stalin's strong suit. The Triumvirate attacked Trotsky throughout 1924 and 1925. They controlled party publications, so Trotsky's articles got edited or rejected. They controlled party meetings, so Trotsky's supporters got shouted down. They accused him of factionalism, of undermining party unity, of putting his personal ambitions above collective leadership. It was all technically against party rules. There was supposed to be freedom of discussion, but party rules only mattered if someone with power enforced them, and the people with power were the ones violating them. Trotsky, for all his intelligence, responded by writing lengthy theoretical treatises explaining why he was right and everyone else was wrong. This convinced precisely nobody who wasn't already convinced. His allies in the party watched as he got bureaucratically dismantled, and most of them decided that their careers were more important than their principles, which is how bureaucratic dismantling usually works. By 1925, Trotsky had been removed as Commissar for Military and Naval Affairs. By 1926, he'd been kicked out of the Politburo. He still had some support, but it was shrinking, and the party apparatus was increasingly dominated by people who understood that backing Trotsky was career suicide. Then Stalin made his move on his erstwhile allies. The triumvirate dissolved. Stalin now allied with Bukharin and the right of the party, while Zinoviev and Kamenev suddenly realized that maybe Lenin's testament had a point after all. Too late, gentlemen. Way too late. Zinoviev and Kamenev, having helped Stalin destroy Trotsky's power base, discovered that they'd been destroying their own leverage in the process. Stalin controlled the party apparatus. Their control of Leningrad and Moscow mattered less than they'd thought, because the General Secretary decided who ran the local party organizations, and Stalin was systematically replacing their people with his people. In a panic, Zinoviev and Kamenev actually allied with Trotsky in 1926 to form what was called the Left Opposition. This was about as effective as you'd expect from people teaming up with the guy they'd spent 2 years destroying. They issued statements, they demanded debates, they appealed to party democracy. The party apparatus, controlled by Stalin, ignored them or shouted them down at meetings. The left opposition argued that the party was becoming bureaucratized, that democracy was being stifled, that Stalin was accumulating too much personal power. They were absolutely right. They'd helped make it possible. Now they were reaping what they'd sown, though unlike actual farmers, they couldn't even harvest their crops before Stalin took them away. By 1927, all three, Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, had been expelled from the party. Trotsky was sent into internal exile in Kazakhstan, then deported from the Soviet Union entirely in 1929. He'd spend the rest of his life in foreign exile, writing books about how Stalin had betrayed the revolution, until Stalin had him assassinated in Mexico in 1940, with an ice axe to the skull, which is perhaps the most darkly appropriate end imaginable for a revolutionary who spent his last years warning that Stalin was dangerous. Zinoviev and Kamenev recanted their views, begged for readmission to the party, and were allowed back. This bought them a few years of uncomfortable rehabilitation, until Stalin decided even that was too much leniency. They'd both be shot in 1936 during the Great Purge, along with pretty much everyone else who'd been prominent in the 1920s. But before we get to the purges, we need to understand how Stalin consolidated power after eliminating the left opposition. Because getting rid of his rivals on the left was only half the battle. The other half was dealing with the right of the party, the people who'd helped him destroy Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev. Bukharin was the face of the right, along with Alexei Rykov and Mikhail Tomsky. They supported the new economic policy, Lenin's compromise with capitalism. They wanted gradual industrialization, voluntary collectivization, patience in building socialism. They thought you could build a socialist economy without terrorizing the peasantry or imposing impossible production quotas on workers. This was probably correct as economic policy, which made it completely unacceptable as Stalin's political program, because by 1928 Stalin had decided that the NEP had to go. The Soviet Union needed rapid industrialization, which required extracting resources from the countryside to fund factory construction. This meant forced collectivization of agriculture, taking peasants' land, combining it into collective farms controlled by the state, and requisitioning grain at whatever price the state felt like paying, which was never a price that peasants felt was fair. They warned it would create economic chaos and political resistance. They were right. Stalin didn't care. He controlled the party apparatus, and the party apparatus controlled the state. By 1929, he'd begun implementing forced collectivization over the right opposition's objections. Bukharin tried to fight back through the same methods that had failed everyone else: appeals to party democracy, theoretical articles, private lobbying of Central Committee members. It went about as well as you'd expect. By 1929, Bukharin was removed from the Politburo and from his position as head of the Comintern. Rykov was replaced as chairman of the Council of People's Commissars, effectively as Prime Minister. Tomsky lost his position as head of the trade unions. The right opposition never even formed a real organized faction. They were outmaneuvered before they could mobilize support. By 1930, they'd all recanted their views and admitted their errors. Bukharin would survive until 1938, when Stalin would have him shot anyway during the purges, because a recantation was never actually a guarantee of safety. It was just a temporary reprieve that could be revoked whenever convenient. By the end of the 1920s, Stalin had achieved something remarkable. He'd eliminated every potential rival for power without resorting to civil war or military coup. He'd done it through bureaucratic manipulation, political alliances that he discarded when convenient, and ruthless exploitation of the party's own structures. Lenin's warning that Stalin was too crude and dangerous for the General Secretary position had proven accurate. The party's inability to heed that warning had proven fatal, not immediately for the party, but eventually for millions of Soviet citizens and for most of the party leadership itself. What made Stalin's rise particularly impressive in a horrifying sort of way, was how he'd used Lenin's cult of personality to legitimize his own power. After Lenin died, his body was embalmed and put on display in a mausoleum in Red Square. This was supposedly temporary until a permanent monument could be built. The temporary mausoleum is still there a century later, which tells you something about the Bolsheviks' relationship with their own stated intentions. The cult of Lenin became official state policy. Cities were renamed after him. Petrograd became Leningrad, which was confusing since Lenin's name wasn't actually Lenin, it was Ulyanov, but never mind. His writings were published in complete collected editions. Schoolchildren memorized his biography. Adults were expected to study his works in party cells and demonstrate proper ideological understanding. Stalin positioned himself as Lenin's most faithful disciple. Never mind that Lenin had explicitly called for Stalin's removal from power. That testament was inconvenient, so it got suppressed. Instead, Stalin gave lectures on Leninism, wrote articles on Leninism, claimed to be defending Leninist orthodoxy against various deviationists. He turned Marxism-Leninism into an official state ideology with himself as its chief interpreter. This was brilliant because it meant that opposing Stalin wasn't just disagreeing with the General Secretary, it was opposing Lenin, opposing the revolution, opposing socialism itself. Stalin wrapped himself in Lenin's authority so thoroughly that attacking one meant attacking the other. Anyone who challenged Stalin's policies could be accused of anti-Leninist deviation, of undermining the revolution, of serving foreign interests or class enemies. The other key to Stalin's success was his ability to appear moderate and reasonable, while his opponents looked like extremists. Trotsky wanted permanent revolution and world war? Reckless. Zinoviev and Kamenev were former oppositionists who doubted Lenin? Untrustworthy. Bukharin wanted to coddle capitalist farmers? Soft on class enemies? Stalin was just trying to build socialism, to defend Lenin's legacy, to maintain party unity. That he was accumulating absolute power while doing all this somehow kept getting overlooked until it was too late. By 1929, Stalin's position was unassailable. He controlled the party apparatus through the General Secretary position. He controlled the political police, the OGPU, successor to the Cheka. He controlled the bureaucracy through appointments and patronage. Most importantly, he controlled the narrative about what the party stood for and where Soviet history was heading. The succession struggle was over. Lenin's federal experiment was about to be tested by its new master, and the relatively restrained political battles of the 1920s, where losers got expelled from the party or sent into exile, were about to give way to something far darker. Stalin was done maneuvering. Now came the part where he broke everything that wouldn't bend to his will. The struggle for Lenin's succession had determined who would control the Soviet experiment. The next phase would determine what kind of experiment it would be, and the answer would be written in starvation, terror, and the industrialization of murder. The relatively bloodless political battles of the 1920s were just the warm-up act. The main event was about to begin, so Stalin had won. He controlled the party, the government, the security apparatus, and the official interpretation of Marxism-Leninism. The question now was what he was going to do with all that power. The answer, it turned out, was to attempt the most ambitious and brutal economic transformation in modern history, one that would industrialize the Soviet Union at breakneck speed while starving millions of people in the process. Not exactly the workers' paradise that had been advertised. By 1928, the Soviet Union faced a genuine dilemma. The new economic policy had restored the economy after the devastation of the Civil War, but it hadn't transformed the USSR into an industrial powerhouse. The country was still overwhelmingly agricultural, with about 80% of the population living in villages and working on farms. Industrial production was recovering but remained far behind Western Europe or the United States. If war came, and Stalin was convinced war was inevitable, the Soviet Union would be crushed by any modern industrial army. The moderate approach, favoured by Bukharin and the right opposition, was gradual industrialization funded by taxes on agricultural production and trade. Let the economy grow steadily, invest the surplus in building factories, avoid disrupting food production. It was sensible, sustainable, and completely unacceptable to Stalin, who wanted rapid transformation and didn't particularly care about sustainability, or, for that matter, about the people who'd have to survive the transformation. Stalin's solution was the command economy, central planning taken to its logical extreme. The state would decide what got produced, where it got produced, how much got produced, and who got to consume it. Market forces? Gone. Private enterprise? Eliminated. Individual choice about your economic activity? Not unless you enjoyed long conversations with the secret police about your bourgeois tendencies. The mechanism for this transformation was the 5-year plan, a concept that sounds reasonable until you realize it meant setting production targets based on what Stalin wanted rather than what was physically possible, and then shooting people when reality refused to comply with the plan. The first 5-year plan was announced in 1928 and officially ran from 1928 to 1932, though it was declared completed in 4 years because nothing says successful planning like changing the timeline when you can't meet your original targets. The goals were absurdly ambitious. Coal production was supposed to increase by 300%, steel production by 400%, electricity generation by 600%. These weren't targets based on careful analysis of resources, labor availability, or technological capacity. They were numbers that sounded impressive in speeches, which is definitely how you should plan an economy if your goal is creating impressive-sounding disasters. To fund this industrial surge, Stalin needed resources, which meant extracting wealth from the countryside. And that meant collectivization, forcing peasants to give up their individual farms and join collective farms controlled by the state. This wasn't presented as "we're going to steal your land and starve millions of you." It was presented as the scientific organization of agriculture, the elimination of capitalist exploitation, and the path to rural prosperity. The peasants were not convinced by this marketing campaign, which should surprise exactly nobody. Let's talk about what collectivization actually meant on the ground, because the gap between the theory and the reality was roughly the size of the Soviet Union itself. In theory, collectivization was voluntary. Peasants would see the obvious advantages of collective farming: pooled resources, modern machinery, efficient organization, and enthusiastically join collective farms called kolkhozes. The state would provide tractors and equipment through machine tractor stations, and everyone would benefit from the economies of scale. Agricultural productivity would soar. Rural life would be transformed. It would be in reality. Local party officials were given quotas for how many households needed to join collective farms, and their careers depended on meeting those quotas. So they showed up in villages with armed activists and explained that joining the kolkhoz was voluntary, but anyone who didn't volunteer would be classified as a kulak, a wealthy peasant exploiter, and dealt with accordingly. This is technically a choice in the same way that your money or your life is technically a choice. The kulak, according to Bolshevik theory, kulaks were rural capitalists who exploited poorer peasants, hired labor, and hoarded grain. They were class enemies who needed to be liquidated as a class. Stalin's exact phrase was "likvidatsiya kulachества как класса," which has an unfortunately precise meaning that everyone involved understood perfectly well. The problem was that kulak didn't have any clear definition. Originally, it meant peasants wealthy enough to hire labor or lend money. By 1930, it meant anyone who opposed collectivization, anyone who seemed to have more resources than their neighbors, anyone who annoyed the local party official, or anyone who happened to be standing nearby when the official needed to meet his dekulakization quota. It was less an economic category than a political weapon, which made it incredibly flexible and utterly arbitrary. The policy of dekulakization, which sounds like something from a corporate restructuring memo but was actually state-sponsored destruction of rural communities, divided kulaks into 3 categories. Category 1, kulaks were counter-revolutionary activists who would be shot or sent to concentration camps. Category 2, kulaks would be deported to remote regions like Siberia or Kazakhstan. Category 3, kulaks would be evicted from their homes and resettled on poor land outside their villages. Notice how none of these categories included left alone to farm in peace, which would have been the reasonable 4th option if reason had any place in Soviet agricultural policy. How many kulaks were there? Stalin's government needed about 5 to 7 million households liquidated to meet their ideological requirements, which they somehow calculated despite kulak being a category without clear definition. This is like trying to plan how many unicorns you need to relocate. The precision is impressive, the connection to reality less so. The dekolakization campaign began in late 1929 and accelerated through 1930. Armed brigades went village to village, confiscating property, arresting designated kulaks, and forcing remaining peasants into collective farms. Kulaks had their homes, tools, livestock and grain seized. Their families were loaded onto trains, in winter naturally because apparently the NKVD thought hypothermia would speed up the process, and deported to special settlements in remote areas where they were expected to build new communities from scratch, in regions where the primary industries were freezing to death and starving to death. The special settlements were not exactly planned communities. They were more like dumping grounds where deported kulaks were left to figure out survival on their own, with minimal supplies, inadequate shelter, and guards who shot anyone trying to leave. Mortality rates in these settlements were catastrophic. People died from cold, hunger, disease, and the general incompatibility between human life and being deposited in the Siberian wilderness in February with no tools and no food. The settlements weren't death camps in the Nazi sense. There were no gas chambers, but they were death camps in the practical sense that enormous numbers of people died in them, which was an outcome that Soviet planners could have predicted if they'd cared about outcomes beyond meeting deportation quotas. Back in the villages, collectivization proceeded about as smoothly as you'd expect when you're forcing people to give up their property under threat of deportation or execution. Peasants slaughtered their livestock rather than hand them over to collective farms. Better to eat your own cow than watch party officials take it, was the reasoning. This was economically disastrous. The Soviet Union lost half its livestock between 1929 and 1933, but emotionally satisfying in the way that burning your house down before the bank forecloses is emotionally satisfying. You're still homeless, but at least the bank doesn't get your house. The collective farms themselves were organizational nightmares. You're taking communities where people farmed family plots, knew their own land, and made their own decisions about planting and harvesting. Now you're forcing them into huge collective farms where some party official, who's never farmed in his life, is making all the decisions based on a plan written in Moscow by people who definitely haven't farmed and aren't entirely clear on what crops grow where. The kolkhozes had to meet production quotas set by the state. These quotas were based on what planners in Moscow thought farms should produce, not on what farms could actually produce given their soil, climate, and available labour. If you didn't meet your quota, it meant you were sabotaging socialism, which was a crime. If you did meet your quota, but it bankrupted the farm for next year, that was next year's problem. Soviet planning operated on approximately the same time horizon as a college student the night before finals. The collective farms also had to deal with the machine tractor stations, MTS, which were supposed to provide modern equipment but actually provided leverage for state control. The MTS owned the tractors and machinery that farms needed. They would send equipment to farms during planting and harvest, and in return the farms had to pay with a percentage of their grain. This meant the state controlled both the production quotas and the equipment necessary to meet those quotas, which was efficient if your goal was maximum state control, and less efficient if your goal was functional agriculture. The MTS operators were often poorly trained, because you can't just take factory workers and tell them they're now tractor drivers without some consequences. Machinery broke down constantly. Spare parts were unavailable or allocated to the wrong places. Fields sometimes sat unplanted because the MTS tractors never showed up, or showed up too late, or showed up and immediately broke down. This wasn't a bug in the system. It was the system, which had been designed by people who understood ideology much better than they understood farming. Meanwhile, local party officials were under tremendous pressure to demonstrate the success of collectivization. This created incentives for, let's say, creative reporting. If your district was supposed to produce 10,000 tons of grain but only produced 7,000, you could either report the truth and be accused of sabotage, or you could report 10,000 tons and hope nobody checked too carefully. Most officials chose the second option, which meant Moscow's statistics on agricultural production were fictional, which meant planning based on those statistics was planning based on fantasy, which meant the next year's quotas were even more impossible to meet. It was a death spiral of bureaucratic lying that would be darkly hilarious if it hadn't killed millions of people. The grain procurement quotas were particularly murderous. After collective farms met their quotas for the state, after they paid the machine tractor stations, after they set aside seed for next year's planting, whatever remained was supposed to be divided among the collective farm workers. In practice, after the state took what it wanted, there often wasn't much remaining, and sometimes there wasn't anything remaining, and sometimes the state kept taking grain even after there was nothing remaining, which is how you get famine. The Ukrainian famine of 1932-1933, known as the Holodomor, was the most devastating consequence of collectivization. Ukraine was the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, with some of the richest agricultural land in the world. Ukrainian peasants had resisted collectivization particularly strongly, which annoyed Stalin, who was not a man who responded well to resistance. The solution was to extract so much grain from Ukraine that resistance became impossible because the resistors were dead. In 1932, Ukraine was assigned grain procurement quotas that were physically impossible to meet. When farms failed to meet these quotas, Brigades of activists went through villages confiscating all available food, not just grain, but potatoes, beets, anything edible. They searched homes, dug up gardens, confiscated livestock. Laws were passed making it illegal for farmers to keep any grain for themselves. Taking even a handful of grain from the collective harvest was classified as theft of socialist property, punishable by 10 years in prison or execution. People were prosecuted for picking up stalks of wheat from already harvested fields, which was apparently considered too much personal initiative in a planned economy. The borders of Ukraine were sealed. Peasants trying to flee to cities or other regions were turned back by NKVD troops. Internal passports were required for travel and peasants didn't have them. The policy was to keep the famine contained in rural areas where it could be more easily hidden from foreign observers and urban populations who might ask awkward questions about why millions of people were starving in a country that was supposedly building socialism. People starved in ways that are difficult to convey without sounding like you're writing horror fiction, except it was real and affected millions of people. Villages became ghost towns as populations died off. Bodies lay in the streets because there was nobody with enough strength to bury them. There are accounts, well-documented accounts that Soviet authorities later tried to suppress, of desperate people resorting to cannibalism. Parents feeding their children and then dying themselves. Children watching their parents die and then dying themselves. Entire families dying in their homes and not being discovered until weeks later. The death toll from the 1932-1933 famine is disputed because Soviet authorities went to great lengths to hide what was happening and falsify records afterward. Current estimates range from 3 to 5 million people, with Ukraine bearing the worst of it. Stalin's government denied that any famine was occurring. Soviet newspapers praised the success of collectivization while millions starved. Foreign journalists who reported on the famine were accused of spreading anti-Soviet propaganda. Walter Duranty, the New York Times correspondent in Moscow, famously denied there was a famine while it was happening, which earned him a Pulitzer Prize and permanent infamy among historians who actually checked whether he was telling the truth. Spoiler, he wasn't. The famine wasn't a natural disaster. It wasn't a crop failure. It was the direct result of state policy, forced collectivization, impossible grain quotas, confiscation of food, and prevention of population movement. Whether you classify it as intentional genocide against Ukrainians specifically, or as a catastrophic consequence of Stalin's agricultural policies that hit Ukraine hardest, is an ongoing historical debate. What's not debatable is that Stalin's government knew what was happening and chose to continue policies that were causing mass death. When you're confiscating food from starving people and preventing them from fleeing to find food elsewhere, you've moved beyond unfortunate policy consequences into you're doing this on purpose. But Stalin got what he wanted. By 1933, collectivization was essentially complete. About 90% of peasant households had been forced into collective farms. The peasantry as an independent class, people who owned their own land and made their own decisions about what to grow and when to plant, had been destroyed. Rural resistance to Soviet power was broken, and the state-controlled agricultural production, which meant it could extract grain to feed industrial workers and export grain to fund the purchase of foreign machinery and expertise for industrialization. The industrial side of the first 5-year plan was only slightly less catastrophic than the agricultural side, which is like saying that being thrown down the stairs is slightly less bad than being thrown off a roof. Technically true, but you're still having a terrible time either way. The plan focused on heavy industry, steel mills, coal mines, power plants, tractor factories. Consumer goods were an afterthought, which meant that even as industrial production was supposedly soaring, ordinary Soviet citizens couldn't find basic necessities like shoes, soap, or decent bread. The logic was that heavy industry would create the foundation for future prosperity, and people could endure temporary hardship for the greater good. The temporary hardship lasted decades, but nobody asked for feedback on the timeline. New industrial cities were built from scratch in remote locations. Magnitogorsk in the Urals became a massive steel-producing complex. Norilsk in the Arctic became a centre for mining nickel and copper. These cities were constructed under conditions that made frontier boom towns look civilized by comparison. Workers lived in barracks or tents, often without adequate heating in regions where winter temperatures reached -40 degrees. They worked 12 or 14-hour shifts, sometimes longer during socialist competitions, where brigades tried to exceed production quotas through sheer enthusiasm and disregard for safety regulations or human endurance. Former peasants fled collectivization and headed to cities looking for industrial work, which at least came with food rations that were more reliable than whatever the collective farm provided. More reliable is doing some heavy lifting in that sentence. Factory rations were often inadequate and erratic, but they were better than starving in a village, which was the alternative for many rural refugees. Then there were the Gulag prisoners. The Gulag, main administration of camps, was the system of forced labour camps that the Soviet state used to dispose of people it found inconvenient, while simultaneously exploiting their labour. The Gulag population expanded enormously during collectivization and industrialization. Kulaks, political prisoners, suspected saboteurs, people who told the wrong joke at the wrong time, people who happened to be in the wrong place when the NKVD needed to fill their arrest quota, all of them ended up in camps building canals, mining gold, cutting timber, and working in factories under conditions that would violate modern labour laws in approximately every way imaginable. Gulag labour was theoretically part of the planned economy. Camp inmates were supposed to contribute to construction projects and industrial production, while simultaneously being reformed through labour. The reform part was propaganda. The reality, prisoners worked in brutal conditions with inadequate food, minimal shelter, and a casualty rate that reflected the fact that the state valued their labour output more than their lives. If prisoners died, there were always more prisoners. The NKVD could arrest more people whenever labour shortages developed, which is definitely a sustainable approach to economic planning if you have an infinite supply of citizens and no moral objections to working them to death. The most infamous Gulag project was the White Sea-Baltic Canal, built between 1931 and 1933 using almost entirely prison labour. The canal, it was built in 20 months using primitive tools. Much of the digging was done with hand tools, wheelbarrows and wooden carts because machinery was scarce and prisoners were plentiful. Somewhere between 12,000 and 25,000 prisoners died during construction, depending on which records you trust and how you count deaths that occurred shortly after people were released due to injury or illness sustained during their imprisonment. The canal, when completed, was too shallow for most ships and froze for much of the year. It was an engineering failure that cost tens of thousands of lives and accomplished almost nothing economically useful. Soviet propaganda praised it as a triumph of socialist labour and the reformation of criminals through work. Maxim Gorky wrote a propaganda book about it celebrating the canal's construction as proof of socialism's humanitarian values, which must be some kind of record for missing the point. The second five-year plan, running from 1933 to 1937, continued the focus on heavy industry, but with slightly less chaos than the first plan, primarily because you can only reorganize an economy catastrophically once before you have to deal with the catastrophe you created. There was also a slight shift toward producing consumer goods and improving living standards, though improvement meant things like, maybe we should produce enough shoes so that factory workers don't have to go barefoot in winter, rather than anything approaching comfort. The industrial achievements were real, even if they came at horrific cost. By the mid-1930s, the Soviet Union had genuinely transformed from an agricultural country into an industrial power. Steel production had increased dramatically. New factories were operating across the country. The USSR was producing tractors, aircraft, tanks, and other machinery that it hadn't been able to produce a decade earlier. When World War II came, this industrial base would prove decisive in allowing the Soviet Union to survive and eventually defeat Nazi Germany. But the human cost was staggering. Between collectivization, famine, and industrialization, millions of people died. The exact number is impossible to determine because Soviet records are incomplete, deliberately falsified or destroyed. Conservative estimates put the death toll from collectivization and famine at around 6 million people. Some historians argue for higher numbers. The dead included kulaks shot or worked to death in special settlements, peasants who starved during the famine, workers who died in industrial accidents or from exhaustion, and gulag prisoners who didn't survive their sentences. For those who survived, life was hard in ways that are difficult to convey to people who've never experienced chronic scarcity. Food was rationed. Housing was cramped. Multiple families sharing single rooms in communal apartments where the kitchen and bathroom were shared with a dozen other families. Privacy didn't exist. Consumer goods were perpetually unavailable. If you needed shoes, you got on a waiting list and hoped your current shoes lasted until your number came up. If you wanted meat, you queued for hours at a state store and bought whatever was available, which was often nothing. The phrase, "they pretend to pay us and we pretend to work," wasn't coined until later, but the sentiment was already developing during the 1930s industrialization drive. The propaganda, meanwhile, was relentless. Posters showed happy workers exceeding production quotas. Newspapers celebrated the achievements of socialist construction. Stalin was praised as the genius leader whose brilliant planning was creating a workers' paradise. The disconnect between propaganda and reality was so vast that it created a kind of cognitive dissonance. Everyone knew things were terrible, but everyone had to pretend they were wonderful, and everyone knew everyone else was pretending, but admitting any of this was politically dangerous. It was like the Stakhanovite movement exemplified this propaganda system. Alexei Stakhanov was a coal miner who supposedly mined 102 tons of coal in a single shift in August 1935, 14 times the normal quota. This was trumpeted as an example of what socialist workers could achieve through revolutionary enthusiasm. What wasn't mentioned was that Stakhanov had a team of helpers, that his equipment had been prepositioned, that his shift had been carefully prepared to maximize his output for this specific demonstration. It was a publicity stunt designed to raise production quotas for everyone else. Other workers were encouraged to become Stakhanovites by exceeding their quotas. Those who succeeded got rewards, better housing, bonuses, medals. Those who didn't were accused of lacking proper socialist consciousness. The whole system was designed to make workers compete against each other and push production higher while blaming any failures on individual workers rather than on unrealistic planning. It was toxic workplace culture codified as state policy, with the added bonus that complaining about toxic workplace culture could get you arrested for defeatism. The social transformation accompanying industrialization was profound. Millions of peasants became industrial workers. Cities grew explosively. Moscow's population nearly doubled during the 1930s. Traditional rural social structures broke down as villages were collectivized and young people fled to factories. The Soviet Union was becoming urban, industrial, and modern in ways that mirrored the transformations that had occurred in Western Europe and America decades earlier, except compressed into a single decade and accomplished through state coercion rather than market forces. Education expanded dramatically. The Soviet Union needed literate workers who could operate machinery, read technical manuals, and follow complex instructions. Literacy schools were built. Technical institutes trained engineers, scientists, and specialists. By the late 1930s, the Soviet Union had a far more educated population than it had in 1920, which was a genuine achievement even if that education included substantial doses of ideological indoctrination about how grateful everyone should be for Stalin's leadership. Women entered the industrial workforce in huge numbers. Soviet ideology proclaimed the equality of women, and while the reality fell short of the rhetoric, women still did most of the domestic labor, faced discrimination in advancement, and were concentrated in lower-paying sectors. The fact remains that Soviet women had access to jobs, education, and careers in ways that would have been impossible under the old regime. This was partly ideological commitment to gender equality, and partly desperate need for labor during rapid industrialization. When you're trying to quadruple steel production in 5 years, you can't afford to exclude half the population from factory work. The 5-year plans created a specific kind of Soviet modernity, industrial, urban, educated, and deeply repressive. It was a society where you could be an engineer working on cutting-edge technology, while living in a communal apartment with 3 other families and queuing for bread. Where you could be a doctor or scientist contributing to genuine advances in your field, while knowing that a single political misstep could land you in a labor camp. Where literacy was universal but reading the wrong book could get you arrested. Where women had careers but everyone was equally subject to state surveillance and political terror. By the end of the 1930s, the USSR had been transformed. It was an industrial power capable of producing tanks, aircraft, and artillery on a massive scale, which would prove essential when Nazi Germany invaded in 1941. It had an educated workforce and a modern infrastructure that, however flawed, represented a dramatic improvement over the pre-revolutionary situation. It had also murdered millions of its own citizens, destroyed traditional rural society, and created a political system where terror was a routine tool of governance. Stalin's industrialization achieved its goal of making the Soviet Union powerful enough to survive total war against Nazi Germany. Whether that justifies the millions of deaths, the destroyed lives, the famine, and the camps is a question that each person has to answer for themselves. Stalin answered it clearly. The cost was acceptable because the end result was a powerful Soviet state. The peasants who starved, the kulaks who died in special settlements, the gulag prisoners who froze to death building canals, the workers who died in industrial accidents, they were acceptable losses in the great project of building socialism. This wasn't an unfortunate side effect of otherwise good policies. It wasn't an accident or a miscalculation. The suffering was built into the system. The 5-year plans required extracting resources from the countryside faster than agriculture could sustain. Collectivization required destroying the peasantry as an independent class. Rapid industrialization required working people past their endurance with inadequate safety measures. The terror, which we'll get to in the next section, was necessary to prevent resistance and ensure compliance with impossible demands. What Stalin created in the 1930s was an industrial totalitarian state, where the government controlled production, consumption, movement, speech, and thought, where failure to meet arbitrary quotas was treated as sabotage, where starving people were prevented from finding food because it might disrupt the plan, where human life mattered less than production statistics. It was socialism built on mass graves, and it would define Soviet reality for decades to come. The machinery of industrialization was in place. The peasantry had been broken. Agricultural production was under state control. Industrial output was rising, however inefficiently. The foundation had been laid for the Soviet Union's emergence as a superpower. All it needed now was for Stalin to ensure that nobody could threaten his control of this massive apparatus of state power. That required eliminating not just political rivals, but anyone who might conceivably become a political rival, or who knew political rivals, or who might know people who knew political rivals. It required the Great Terror, and we're about to see what happened when Stalin turned the same ruthless determination he'd applied to industrialization toward the destruction of potential opposition within the party and society. The cost in lives would make the famine look like a warm-up act. So Stalin had industrialized the Soviet Union, collectivized agriculture, and transformed millions of peasants into factory workers, all while starving millions of people in the process. You might think he'd take a break at this point, maybe enjoy his absolute power for a bit. Instead, he decided to launch the most extensive political purge in modern history, one that would consume the Communist Party, the military, the intelligentsia, and essentially anyone unlucky enough to attract the attention of the security services. Because apparently running a massive country undergoing rapid industrialization wasn't enough to keep Stalin busy. He also needed a hobby, and his hobby was making everyone in the Soviet Union terrified that they'd be arrested at 3 a.m. The Great Terror, also called the Great Purge or the Yezhovshchina, named after Nikolai Yezhov, who ran the secret police during the worst of it, lasted from about 1936 to 1938, though really it began earlier, and the atmosphere of fear it created lasted until Stalin's death in 1953. The exact death toll is disputed because accurate record-keeping wasn't exactly a priority when you're conducting mass executions, but conservative estimates put it at around 750,000 executions during the peak years, with another 1 million or so people dying in the Gulag camps. Some historians argue for higher numbers. The point is that Stalin's government systematically murdered hundreds of thousands of its own citizens, while imprisoning millions more, and it did this not because of a war or an invasion or an external threat, but because Stalin wanted to eliminate any possible challenge to his power, no matter how remote or imaginary that challenge might be. This wasn't random violence. It was organized, bureaucratized, systematized violence. The NKVD, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, which was the secret police, had arrest quotas to meet. Regional offices were assigned specific numbers of people to arrest in different categories. Category 1 was for execution. Category 2 was for the Gulag. If you didn't arrest enough people, you clearly weren't taking the threat of counter-revolutionary activity seriously enough, which might mean you were sympathetic to counter-revolutionaries, which might mean you needed to be arrested. It was like a sales quota system, except instead of selling widgets, you were arresting your neighbours and missing your targets could get you shot. The terror began with the old Bolsheviks, the people who'd made the revolution with Lenin, who'd been Stalin's colleagues and rivals during the 1920s. These were the men who'd helped build the Soviet state, who'd fought in the Civil War, who'd spent years in Tsarist prisons for revolutionary activity. They'd survived wars, survived political struggles, survived famine. They did not, however, survive Stalin's paranoia about anyone who might remember that he wasn't always the absolute dictator of the USSR. Zinoviev and Kamenev, who'd allied with Stalin against Trotsky, and then been destroyed when Stalin turned on them, had been kicked out of the party, readmitted, and humiliated multiple times through the early 1930s. In 1936, they were put on trial in the first of the Great Show trials, the Moscow trials, that would become the public face of the terror. The trial was pure theatre. The charges were absurd. Zinoviev and Kamenev were accused of plotting to assassinate Stalin and other Soviet leaders, of working with Trotsky to organize terrorist attacks, of collaborating with foreign intelligence services to undermine the Soviet Union. None of this was remotely true, but truth wasn't really the point. The point was confession. Zinoviev and Kamenev stood in court and confessed to all these crimes in elaborate detail. They described conspiracies that never existed, meetings that never happened, plots they never planned. They did this because they'd been promised that if they confessed publicly, their families would be spared. This was a lie, naturally, because Stalin's promises had roughly the same value as a warranty from a company that went bankrupt before manufacturing its product. Both men were executed in August 1936. Their families were arrested anyway. Zinoviev's last words, reportedly, were, "Please, for God's sake, call Joseph Vissarionovich." Joseph Vissarionovich was Stalin's first name and patronymic. Stalin did not take the call. The second Moscow trial came in January 1937, featuring another group of old Bolsheviks including Karl Radek and Grigory Pyatakov. Again, elaborate confessions to fantastic conspiracies involving Trotsky, foreign powers, and industrial sabotage. Again, executions or long prison sentences that amounted to death sentences anyway, because the Gulag had a way of killing people even without explicitly executing them. The third and largest Moscow trial was in March 1938. This one featured Bukharin, who'd been Stalin's ally against Trotsky and the left opposition, who'd been called the favourite of the whole party by Lenin, who'd opposed forced collectivization and been proven right about its catastrophic consequences. Bukharin was accused of plotting to murder Lenin back in 1918, of organising Kulak uprisings, of working to restore capitalism. The charges were so ridiculous that at one point Bukharin's lawyer, appointed by the state obviously, actually argued that his client must be guilty because the charges were so serious. This is legal defence work at its absolute finest, really inspiring confidence in the judicial system. Bukharin tried to defend himself somewhat by confessing to general counter-revolutionary activity while denying specific crimes. He played word games in his confession, trying to leave hints that the whole thing was forced. It didn't help. He was convicted and executed. His wife was sent to the Gulag. His infant son was sent to an orphanage. The thoroughness with which the Soviet state destroyed its perceived enemies extended to making sure their children suffered too, because apparently Stalin thought revolutionary credentials were hereditary and needed to be eliminated at the genetic level. The show trials were the public face of the terror, but they represented a tiny fraction of the people being arrested and executed. For every old Bolshevik tried in Moscow with foreign journalists watching, there were thousands of ordinary party members, officials, workers and peasants being arrested in the middle of the night and shot in the basement of an NKVD building without any trial at all. The terror swept through the Communist Party systematically. Between 1936 and 1938, the party lost about a third of its membership, not through resignation, but through arrest and execution. The accusations were formulaic: Trotskyism, counter-revolutionary activity, espionage for foreign powers, sabotage, terrorism. It didn't matter if you'd been a loyal Stalinist for years. It didn't matter if you'd participated in earlier purges. Previous loyalty meant nothing. Previous service meant nothing. What mattered was whether the NKVD needed to meet its arrest quota, and you happened to be convenient. The logic of the terror was self-perpetuating. When someone was arrested, they'd be tortured, not always physically, though physical torture was certainly used, but also through sleep deprivation, threats to family members, mock executions, and psychological pressure that would break almost anyone eventually. Under torture, people confessed to whatever crimes their interrogators wanted, and those confessions would implicate other people, who would then be arrested and tortured and forced to confess and implicate still more people. It was like a chain letter from hell, except instead of promising good luck if you passed it on, it promised execution if you didn't name enough co-conspirators. The military suffered particularly devastating purges. The Red Army, which was supposed to be the defender of the Soviet state, was gutted by Stalin's paranoia about military officers becoming too powerful or too independent. Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, one of the most talented Soviet military commanders and a veteran of the Civil War, was arrested in May 1937 along with 7 other high-ranking generals. They were accused of plotting with Germany and Japan to overthrow the Soviet government. The military purges expanded from there. 3 of the 5 marshals of the Soviet Union were executed. 13 of 15 army commanders were executed. 8 of 9 admirals were executed. About half of the officer corps, something like 35,000 officers, were arrested, with most either executed or sent to camps. This wasn't trimming dead wood. This was taking a functioning military and deliberately destroying its leadership structure on the eve of the largest war in human history. When Germany invaded in 1941, the Red Army was commanded largely by inexperienced officers who'd been promoted rapidly to fill the gaps left by the purges. The initial disasters of Operation Barbarossa owed a lot to Stalin having shot or imprisoned everyone with actual military expertise. The secret police weren't immune either, which has a certain dark irony to it. Genrikh Yagoda, who'd been head of the NKVD from 1934 to 1936 and had organised the early phases of the terror, was arrested in 1937, tried in the Third Moscow trial, and executed. His replacement, Nikolai Yezhov, the man the Yezhovshchina is named after, presided over the worst years of the terror, 1937 and 1938, when the mass arrests and executions reached their peak. Yezhov was a small man, barely 5 feet tall, which Stalin apparently found amusing. He was also a committed bureaucrat of terror who implemented the quota system for arrests and executions with great efficiency. By late 1938, Stalin decided that the terror had gone far enough, not because he suddenly developed a conscience, but because it was destabilizing the country and creating too much chaos in the party and state apparatus. Yezhov was removed from office in November 1938, arrested in April 1939, and executed in February 1940. His replacement was Lavrenti Beria, who was, if anything, even more sinister than his predecessors, though he had the good sense to scale back the mass terror while continuing it in more targeted ways. Beria would survive until 1953, when he was arrested and executed shortly after Stalin's death, which suggests that working as Stalin's secret police chief was not a position with great job security or good retirement prospects. The machinery of the terror ran on confessions, and confessions were obtained through interrogation techniques that range from psychological pressure to outright torture. The NKVD interrogators had a toolkit of methods. Sleep deprivation was common. Keep someone awake for days or weeks, and they'll eventually sign anything to make it stop. Beatings were standard, breaking bones, pulling out fingernails, using various implements to cause maximum pain, all documented in survivor accounts and NKVD records that became available after the Soviet collapse. But often the most effective technique was simpler: threaten the suspect's family. Tell a man that his wife will be arrested if he doesn't confess, that his children will be sent to orphanages, that his parents will be shot. Most people broke under that pressure. You might be able to endure physical torture yourself, but watching your family be destroyed because you won't confess to crimes you didn't commit, that's harder to resist. The NKVD understood this perfectly well and exploited it ruthlessly. The confessions obtained through torture were then used as evidence in trials, show trials for the important cases, perfunctory closed trials for everyone else. The trials were procedurally farcical. Defense judges were under pressure to convict. Acquittal was essentially impossible. If the NKVD arrested you, you must be guilty, because the NKVD didn't make mistakes. Questioning whether the NKVD made mistakes was itself suspicious behavior that might indicate counter-revolutionary tendencies. Sentences were either death or the Gulag. Death sentences were usually carried out quickly, with a single shot to the back of the head in the basement of an NKVD building. The bodies were buried in mass graves or cremated. Families were told their loved one had been sentenced to 10 years without right of correspondence, which was bureaucratic code for "we executed them, but we're not going to tell you that." Years later, families might learn the truth, or they might not. The Soviet state was not big on closure. The Gulag system expanded enormously during the terror. Camps were scattered across the Soviet Union, but concentrated in remote regions: Siberia, Kazakhstan, the Arctic. Prisoners were used as forced labour on construction projects, in mines, logging forests, building railways. The economic logic was that prisoners could be worked harder than free labourers, because their survival wasn't particularly important to the state. If prison camp conditions varied, but were generally somewhere between terrible and catastrophic. Prisoners in Arctic camps worked outdoors in temperatures that dropped to minus 50 degrees Celsius, often without adequate clothing or shelter. Food rations were calculated to keep prisoners barely alive, enough to work, not enough to maintain health. Medical care was minimal. Hygiene was primitive. Diseases spread rapidly in overcrowded barracks. Guards were often criminals themselves, recruited from the prisoner population and given power over other prisoners in exchange for marginally better treatment. The camp Camp administrators were evaluated on how well their camps met economic targets. Tons of coal mined, cubic meters of timber cut, kilometers of railway laid. This created incentives to work prisoners past their endurance, because your job performance depended on your camp's output, and dead prisoners could be replaced more easily than missed quotas could be explained to Moscow. Some camps were genuinely productive economically. The camps mining gold in Kolyma, in the Far East, produced significant quantities of gold that helped fund Soviet industrialization. But many camps were economic disasters. The labor was too unskilled, the conditions too harsh, the organization too chaotic for efficient production. The White Sea-Baltic Canal, which we mentioned earlier, was supposed to demonstrate the efficiency of Gulag labor. Instead, it demonstrated that building complex infrastructure with starving prisoners using hand tools is neither efficient nor effective, though it is quite good at killing prisoners. The intellectual and cultural elite weren't spared. Writers, scientists, engineers, artists, anyone with education or prominence was vulnerable. The charges were usually espionage or wrecking, deliberately sabotaging Soviet industry or science. Engineers were accused of designing defects into machinery. Scientists were accused of falsifying research to undermine Soviet progress. Writers were accused of hiding counter-revolutionary messages in their work. The absurdity of these charges didn't matter. What mattered was eliminating anyone who might think independently or question the party line. Osip Mandelstam, one of Russia's greatest poets, was arrested in 1934 for writing a poem that mocked Stalin, not published, just shared with friends. He was sentenced to exile, arrested again in 1938, and died in a transit camp. Isaac Babel, the brilliant short story writer, was arrested in 1939 and executed in 1940. Vsevolod Meyerhold, the innovative theatre director, was arrested in 1939, tortured and executed in 1940. His wife, the actress Zinaida Reich, was murdered in their apartment shortly after his arrest, in what was almost certainly an NKVD operation, though officially it was an unsolved crime. The terror also targeted national minorities, particularly those whose ethnic homelands bordered foreign countries. Stalin's paranoia about potential fifth columns led to mass deportations and executions of Poles, Germans, Koreans, and other groups deemed potentially disloyal. The logic was preventive. These people might side with foreign powers in a future war, so better to eliminate or disperse them now. This was collective punishment based on ethnicity, applied with typical Stalinist thoroughness. During 1937 and 1938, the NKVD conducted an operation against Poles living in the USSR. About 140,000 people were arrested as alleged Polish spies. Of those, about 110,000 were executed. This was genocide by any reasonable definition, the systematic destruction of a national group. Similar operations targeted Germans, Koreans, and other minorities. The Korean population of the Soviet Far East, about 200,000 people, was deported to Kazakhstan in 1937. They were loaded onto trains, transported thousands of kilometers, and dumped in Central Asia with minimal supplies or preparation. They were told to build new lives in regions where they didn't speak the language, didn't know the climate, and weren't welcome. Thousands died during the deportation and resettlement. This was Stalin's solution to the Korean question: get rid of them before Japan could potentially use them as a pretext for invasion or intelligence gathering. The terror created a society where everyone was afraid all the time. You couldn't trust your colleagues because they might denounce you to save themselves. You couldn't trust your neighbours because they might report an overheard conversation to the NKVD. You couldn't even trust your family entirely because children were encouraged to denounce parents if they heard counter-revolutionary talk at home. The most famous case was Pavlik Morozov, a boy who supposedly denounced his father as a kulak. Young Pavlik was murdered, probably by relatives angry about his denunciation, and turned into a Soviet martyr, held up as an example of putting revolutionary consciousness above family loyalty. The story was mostly fabricated, but it served its purpose of teaching Soviet children that loyalty to Stalin came before loyalty to parents. Denunciations became a fact of life. People denounced others out of fear. Better to denounce someone else before they denounce you. People denounced others out of spite, settling personal grudges by accusing someone of counter-revolutionary activity. People denounced others out of ambition, removing a rival for a promotion by having them arrested. The NKVD received millions of denunciations during the terror years. Most were investigated at least minimally. Many led to arrests. Some were obviously false, but even obviously false denunciations had to be taken seriously, because ignoring a denunciation might mean you were protecting counter-revolutionaries, which made you a counter-revolutionary yourself. Living through the terror meant adapting to constant uncertainty. You went to work not knowing if you'd come home that night. You went to bed not knowing if there'd be a knock on the door at 3 a.m. The NKVD preferred nighttime arrests because they were more disorienting and created less public disturbance. You had to be careful about everything you said, everything you wrote, everyone you associated with. A joke about Stalin could be reported as counter-revolutionary agitation. Friendship with someone who later got arrested could make you guilty by association. Having foreign contacts, even something as innocent as a pen pal abroad, could be evidence of espionage. The terror warped human relationships in profound ways. Parents stopped talking about politics in front of their children. Friends stopped confiding in each other. Colleagues maintained elaborate pretenses of loyalty while privately terrified. The gap between what people said in public and what they thought in private became absolute. Everyone wore a mask of enthusiastic Soviet loyalty while privately wondering when their turn would come. And yet, remarkably, most people weren't arrested. The terror was pervasive but not universal. About 7% of the population passed through the Gulag system at some point during Stalin's rule. That's millions of people, a catastrophic number, but it also means that 93% of people avoided arrest. You could survive by being politically inconspicuous, by avoiding attention, by not standing out in any way. The safest strategy was to be absolutely ordinary, to blend into the background, to never express an original thought or take an independent action. The terror also had a generational component. Stalin was eliminating the old Bolsheviks who remembered the revolution, who remembered Lenin, who had their own sources of legitimacy independent of Stalin. The new generation of Soviet officials rising in the late 1930s had no independent political base. They owed their positions entirely to Stalin. They'd advanced by filling positions vacated when their predecessors were arrested. They understood that loyalty to Stalin was the only principle that mattered, and that Stalin's loyalty to them lasted only as long as they remained useful. This created a particular kind of political culture, utterly subservient to Stalin personally, rather than to the party, or to any ideological principle. Soviet officials became adept at reading Stalin's moods, anticipating his desires, and avoiding anything that might displease him. They also became adept at backstabbing each other, because Stalin encouraged rivalries among his subordinates as a way of preventing them from uniting against him. It was court politics as vicious as anything in an absolute monarchy, except with ideological justification and modern bureaucracy added to the mix. The economic impact of the terror was significant. Shooting or imprisoning a large percentage of your engineers, managers, scientists, and technical specialists does not improve industrial productivity, despite Stalinist rhetoric about eliminating saboteurs. Factory output declined in many sectors as experienced workers and managers were arrested. Agricultural production suffered as collective farm chairmen were purged. The military's combat effectiveness was severely compromised by the destruction of its officer corps. In purely practical terms, the terror was counterproductive. It weakened the Soviet Union at a time when international tensions were rising and war was approaching. But Stalin wasn't primarily concerned with efficiency. He was concerned with control. The terror eliminated everyone who might pose a threat, everyone who had independent standing, everyone who might remember that things could be different. It created a population that was traumatized, atomized, and too afraid to resist. It established Stalin's absolute power so thoroughly that no one dared challenge him even when his policies were obviously disastrous. By late 1938, when the mass terror was scaled back, the damage was done. The Communist Party had been decimated and rebuilt with people who owed everything to Stalin. The military had been purged of experienced officers. The intelligentsia had been cowed into submission. National minorities had been terrorized or deported. The Gulag was full of prisoners providing slave labor, and Stalin's cult of personality had reached absurd heights. He was praised as the greatest genius in history, the wise leader, the father of peoples, the man who was always right about everything. The terror formally ended in 1938, but the fear it created never really went away. Soviet citizens who lived through it carried the trauma for the rest of their lives. They learned that the state could destroy you on a whim, that justice was a fiction, that survival required constant vigilance and the suppression of anything resembling independent thought. The terror also established a pattern that would continue in modified forms throughout Soviet history. After Stalin died in 1953, the mass executions stopped and the Gulag population decreased, but the basic system of political repression remained. Dissidents in the 1960s and 1970s weren't usually executed. They were sent to labour camps or psychiatric hospitals or exiled abroad. The methods became less lethal, but the principle was the same: absolute intolerance for any deviation from the party line. The Great Terror remains one of the hardest periods of Soviet history to comprehend, not because the facts are unclear — we have extensive documentation from Soviet archives — but because the scale and arbitrariness of it are so extreme. Stalin murdered hundreds of thousands of his own supporters, destroyed the party that had brought him to power, crippled the institutions he depended on, and did all this while claiming to be protecting the revolution from its enemies. The enemies were imaginary. The victims were real, and the system he created through terror would shape Soviet life for decades, even after the terror itself ended. The machinery of self-destruction that Stalin built in the 1930s was incredibly effective at destroying people. It was less effective at building socialism, creating prosperity, or serving the interests of Soviet citizens. But it was extremely effective at concentrating power in Stalin's hands, which was ultimately the point. Everything else — economic development, military strength, social welfare, even the survival of the revolution itself — was secondary to maintaining Stalin's absolute control. And that control would be tested soon. Because while Stalin was busy shooting his own generals and terrorizing his own population, a real threat was emerging in Europe. Nazi Germany was rearming, expanding, and preparing for conquest. Stalin would have to deal with Hitler, and he'd have to do it with a military leadership that he'd gutted, a population that was traumatized and suspicious, and a diplomatic position that he'd undermined through his own paranoia and brutality. The terror had prepared the Soviet Union for total control. It hadn't prepared it for total war. That preparation would come at an even higher cost. While Stalin was busy terrorizing his own population and shooting his generals, the Soviet Union still had to exist in the actual world with actual other countries, some of which were not particularly thrilled about having a revolutionary communist state on the map. This created an interesting diplomatic challenge. How do you maintain international relations when your official ideology declares that you're working to overthrow every other government on the planet? The Soviet solution was a masterpiece of cynical pragmatism: maintain official diplomatic ties and normal state relations while simultaneously supporting communist parties trying to destabilize those same states. It was having your cake and eating it too, except the cake was international revolution, and eating it involved funding strikes and attempted coups in countries you had embassies in. The early Soviet Union existed in what amounted to international quarantine. Most Western governments didn't recognize the Bolshevik regime as legitimate. The Soviet Union had repudiated all of Imperial Russia's debts, which was popular domestically but less popular with French and British investors who'd loaned the Tsar money. The Bolsheviks had also nationalized foreign-owned property without compensation, published secret treaties from World War I that embarrassed everyone involved, and generally announced that they planned to encourage workers everywhere to overthrow their governments. This wasn't exactly a diplomatic strategy designed to win friends and influence people, unless the people you wanted to influence were revolutionary socialists who already agreed with you. The United States didn't recognize the Soviet Union until 1933. Britain wavered between recognition and hostility depending on which party was in power. France was angry about the debt repudiation. The Soviet Union was diplomatically isolated, which was partly the fault of Western hostility, but also partly the fault of the Bolsheviks' insistence on combining state diplomacy with revolutionary agitation in ways that made normal diplomatic relations basically impossible. But isolation wasn't sustainable. The Soviet Union needed trade to industrialize. It needed technology, machinery, and technical expertise from advanced industrial countries. It needed at least some diplomatic relationships to prevent being invaded by everyone simultaneously. So Soviet foreign policy evolved into a two-track system: the official diplomatic track handled by the Foreign Commissariat, and the revolutionary track handled by the Comintern, the Communist International, which funded and directed communist parties abroad. The Comintern was founded in 1919 with the explicit goal of promoting world revolution. It was headquartered in Moscow, funded by the Soviet government, and effectively controlled by Stalin once he consolidated power. Communist parties from other countries were required to follow Comintern directives, which meant following Soviet foreign policy interests, even when those interests had nothing to do with promoting revolution. The Comintern was simultaneously a revolutionary organization and a tool of Soviet state power, which created some awkward contradictions when Soviet diplomatic needs conflicted with revolutionary strategy. For example, When the Soviet Union wanted better relations with Germany in the 1920s, the Comintern told the German Communist Party to tone down its revolutionary activity. When the Soviet Union wanted to pressure Poland, the Comintern encouraged more aggressive action by Polish communists. Communist parties abroad found themselves caught between serving the international revolution and serving Soviet state interests, which weren't always the same thing. Unsurprisingly, Soviet state interests always won, because the people making the decisions were in Moscow and had the power to replace foreign communist leaders who got too independent-minded. This two-track diplomacy created situations that were almost comically cynical. Soviet ambassadors would attend official diplomatic functions and assure their hosts that the Soviet Union respected national sovereignty and had no intention of interfering in the internal affairs. Meanwhile, down the street, the Comintern representative was meeting with local communists and handing out money for strikes, propaganda, and organizing revolutionary cells. Western governments understood this perfectly well, but couldn't do much about it because the Comintern was technically a separate organization from the Soviet government, even though everyone knew it was controlled by Moscow. It was the diplomatic equivalent of "I'm not touching you," while holding your finger an inch from someone's face. The Soviet Union's first major diplomatic breakthrough came with Germany, not Nazi Germany, but the Weimar Republic that preceded it. The Treaty of Rapallo in 1922 established diplomatic and economic relations between the Soviet Union and Germany. This was a marriage of convenience between two international outcasts. Germany had been defeated in World War I, stripped of territory and burdened with massive reparations payments. The Soviet Union was revolutionary, isolated, and desperate for trade. They needed each other, which created what both sides must have known was a temporary alignment of interests based on mutual resentment of the post-war order. The relationship went beyond trade. The Treaty of Rapallo included secret military cooperation clauses. Secret because the Treaty of Versailles prohibited Germany from having certain types of military equipment and training programs. So Germany built and tested tanks in the Soviet Union, trained pilots at Soviet airfields, and developed chemical weapons at Soviet facilities. In exchange, the Soviet Union got access to German military technology and training methods. Both countries were violating international agreements, but they were doing it together, which apparently made it more acceptable to them if not to anyone else. This cooperation continued through the 1920s. German military advisors helped modernize the Red Army. Soviet officers trained at German facilities. German companies built factories in the Soviet Union. It was a pragmatic arrangement that demonstrated how flexible ideological commitments become when national security interests are involved. The Soviets were collaborating with capitalist Germany while officially promoting world revolution. The Germans were collaborating with communist Russia while suppressing communists at home. Nobody seemed to find this particularly contradictory, or if they did, they kept quiet about it because the arrangement was too useful to abandon for the sake of ideological consistency. Through the 1920s and early 1930s, Soviet foreign policy operated in this dual mode, seeking normal diplomatic relations and trade agreements, while simultaneously supporting revolutionary movements. It worked reasonably well as long as the revolutionary movements were ineffective enough not to seriously threaten Soviet diplomatic interests. When communist uprisings actually looked like they might succeed, as in Germany in 1923, Soviet policy became more cautious because a failed revolution would damage Soviet relations with the German government. The revolution failed anyway, which was convenient for Soviet diplomacy if not for German communists. The rise of Hitler changed everything. When the Nazis took power in Germany in 1933, Soviet-German cooperation ended abruptly. Hitler was explicitly anti-communist, and had written extensively about his plans to destroy the Soviet Union and colonize its territory. This was not diplomatic posturing, it was actual Nazi ideology that they intended to implement. The Soviet Union suddenly had a genuinely hostile major power on its doorstep, which concentrated Stalin's mind wonderfully on the need for better relations with Western democracies. The shift in Soviet foreign policy was dramatic. Where previously the Comintern had instructed communist parties to treat social democrats as enemies, social fascists in the charming terminology of the early 1930s, now the policy became cooperation with anyone willing to oppose fascism. This was the Popular Front strategy. Communists should ally with socialists, liberals, and anyone else willing to resist fascist movements. It was a complete reversal of previous policy, implemented with the kind of ideological flexibility that comes from having absolute control over communist parties abroad, and no need to explain your contradictions. The Popular Front strategy had some success. In France and Spain, communists entered into coalition governments with socialist and liberal parties. These coalitions were always unstable. Communists and social democrats had spent years denouncing each other, and suddenly they were supposed to cooperate based on Moscow's instructions. But the strategy did create broader anti-fascist alliances, at least temporarily. Soviet foreign policy also pursued collective security arrangements with Western powers. The goal was to create an alliance system that would contain Nazi Germany through combined pressure. In 1934, the Soviet Union joined the League of Nations, the international organization it had previously dismissed as a tool of imperialist powers. Stalin's foreign commissar, Maxim Litvinov, became an advocate for collective security and international cooperation against aggression. This was quite a shift from the early Bolshevik position of expecting and encouraging the collapse of the capitalist world order. Litvinov was Jewish, spoke fluent English, and was married to an Englishwoman, which made him useful for negotiations with Western powers, who found him more acceptable than some of Stalin's other officials. He was also a genuine believer in collective security as the best defense against Nazi Germany. Unfortunately for Litvinov, Stalin's commitment to collective security was entirely tactical rather than principled, which would become brutally clear when Stalin decided that collective security wasn't working and needed a different approach. The Soviet Union signed mutual assistance pacts with France and Czechoslovakia in 1935. These treaties promised mutual defense in case of German aggression. They looked impressive on paper. In practice, they were nearly useless because none of the signatories trusted each other. France didn't trust the Soviet Union because it was communist. The Soviet Union didn't trust France because it was capitalist and had a history of anti-Bolshevik intervention. Czechoslovakia was caught in the middle, hoping that treaty commitments would mean something if Germany attacked. Spoiler, they wouldn't. The Spanish Civil War, starting in 1936, became a proxy conflict that demonstrated all the contradictions in Soviet foreign policy. When Spanish military officers led by Francisco Franco launched a coup against the elected Republican government, Germany and Italy supported Franco with troops, aircraft, and supplies. The Soviet Union supported the Republican government, but in ways that served Soviet interests rather than Spanish ones. Soviet aid to Republican Spain came with strings attached. The Soviets sent military advisors, weapons, and international brigade volunteers, foreign communists recruited through the Comintern to fight in Spain. But Stalin also used Spain as an opportunity to extend Soviet control over the Spanish Communist Party and eliminate rivals. NKVD agents operated in Spain, purging anarchists and non-Stalinist leftists who were supposedly on the same side. The most infamous incident was the suppression of the Pulm, the Workers' Party of Marxist Unification, whose leaders were arrested and murdered by Soviet agents for being the wrong kind of communists. George Orwell, who fought with the PAM militia, wrote about this experience in Homage to Catalonia, describing how the communists were more interested in eliminating rival leftists than in defeating Franco. Soviet intervention in Spain was also limited by Stalin's unwillingness to provoke Britain and France by getting too involved. The Western democracies had adopted a policy of non-intervention, refusing to support either side in Spain, even though Germany and Italy were actively supporting Franco. The Soviet Union provided enough aid to keep the Republic fighting, but not enough to win, because winning might upset the collective security strategy Stalin was pursuing with the West. The result was that the Republic was slowly bled to death. Franco won in 1939, and Spain became another fascist dictatorship. Soviet policy had been too cynical to save the Republic, but too committed to waste resources on a losing cause. The collective security strategy began collapsing in 1938. The Munich Agreement in September 1938 allowed Nazi Germany to annex the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia. Britain and France agreed to this. They actually pressured Czechoslovakia to surrender territory to avoid war with Germany. The Soviet Union wasn't invited to the Munich Conference, despite having a mutual assistance treaty with Czechoslovakia. Stalin watched as the Western democracies appeased Hitler by handing over a chunk of Czechoslovakia, which suggested that collective security meant, let Hitler expand eastward, and maybe he'll leave us alone. Munich convinced Stalin that Britain and France weren't serious about resisting Germany. He concluded they were happy to let Hitler attack the Soviet Union, which would conveniently eliminate both Nazism and communism in a mutually destructive war while the Western powers watched from the sidelines. Whether this assessment was accurate is debatable. British and French policy was less Machiavellian and more incompetent. But Stalin believed it, and he acted accordingly. The result was the most cynical diplomatic reversal of the entire interwar period, the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, signed in August 1939. Stalin fired Litvinov, the the Jewish diplomat who'd spent years building collective security arrangements, and replaced him with Vyacheslav Molotov, whose main qualification was absolute loyalty to Stalin. Molotov negotiated directly with German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, and on August 23, 1939, they signed a pact promising that Germany and the Soviet Union wouldn't attack each other. The Public Non-Aggression Pact was shocking enough. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union were supposedly ideological opposites. But the secret protocols were even more remarkable. Germany and the Soviet Union agreed to divide Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Poland would be partitioned between them. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, would go to the Soviet Union. Bessarabia in Romania would also go to the Soviet Union. It was the carve-up of Eastern Europe between two totalitarian powers, negotiated in secret and implemented with brutal efficiency. The pact, communist parties abroad, which had spent years denouncing fascism, suddenly had to defend the alliance between Hitler and Stalin. Communist intellectuals who joined the party to fight fascism quit in disgust. The Comintern's credibility, already questionable, was destroyed. The official Soviet line was that the pact was a brilliant diplomatic move that gave the USSR time to prepare for eventual war with Germany. Critics pointed out that Stalin was essentially collaborating with Hitler to invade Poland and divide up Eastern Europe, which wasn't exactly the moral high ground. On September, Britain and France, which had alliance commitments to Poland, declared war on Germany. This was the start of World War II in Europe. On September 17th, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east, implementing its side of the secret protocols. Polish forces, already being crushed by the Germans, now faced a Soviet invasion from behind. The Polish government fled. Poland was partitioned, just as the Nazi-Soviet pact had specified. Germany and the Soviet Union held a joint victory parade in the Polish city of Brest-Litovsk, which was an image that rather undermined Soviet claims about being anti-fascist. The Soviet Union spent the next 2 years implementing its spheres of influence in Eastern Europe. The Baltic states were forced to accept Soviet military bases, then occupied, then annexed as Soviet Socialist republics in 1940. The annexation was dressed up with fake elections where the only candidates were communists, and the reported turnout was over 90% in favour of joining the USSR, because that's definitely how voluntary union works. Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania lost their independence and wouldn't regain it until 1991. In Romania, the Soviet Union demanded and received Bessarabia and northern Bukovina. Romania handed them over because the alternative was war with the Soviet Union, and Romania had just watched Poland get crushed. Bessarabia became the Moldavian Soviet Socialist Republic, another addition to the USSR achieved through territorial expansion rather than revolution. The Soviet Union also attacked Finland in November 1939, in what became known as the Winter War. Finland refused Soviet demands for territorial concessions and a military base. So the Red Army invaded, expecting a quick victory. Finland had a small army but defended fiercely, using mobile ski troops and knowledge of the terrain to inflict heavy casualties on Soviet forces. The Red Army, still recovering from the purges that had destroyed its officer corps, performed abysmally. It took 3 months of brutal winter warfare for the Soviets to force Finland to cede some territory in March 1940. The Soviet Union won, technically, but at enormous cost. Perhaps 150,000 Soviet casualties to take relatively small amounts of Finnish territory. The performance was so poor that it convinced Hitler that the Red Army was weak and vulnerable, which would have consequences in 1941. The Winter War also got the Soviet Union expelled from the League of Nations, which was ironic since the USSR had joined specifically to promote collective security against aggression. Now the Soviet Union was the aggressor, attacking a small neighbour without provocation. The League's condemnation meant nothing practically. The League of Nations was already irrelevant. But it symbolised how far Soviet foreign policy had shifted from collective security to naked territorial expansion. During the period of the Nazi-Soviet Pact, from August 1939 to June 1941, the Soviet Union and Germany maintained friendly relations that were deeply strange given their ideological opposition. The Soviet Union supplied Germany with raw materials, grain, oil, minerals, that helped fuel the German war machine. German and Soviet officials exchanged visits. Soviet and German security services cooperated on suppressing Polish resistance in their respective occupation zones. The Soviets even handed over German communists who'd fled to the USSR, returning them to Germany where they were imprisoned or executed by the Nazis. This was the level of cooperation Stalin was willing to engage in to maintain the pact. Stalin convinced himself, or at least acted as if he'd convinced himself, that Hitler would respect the non-aggression pact. Soviet intelligence received numerous warnings that Germany was preparing to invade. Richard's Soviet border units reported German troop concentrations. Churchill's government sent warnings. Stalin, he believed, or wanted to believe, that Hitler wouldn't attack while still fighting Britain, and that the non-aggression pact had bought time that the Soviet Union could use to prepare. The preparation wasn't adequate. The Red Army was larger than in 1939, but still recovering from the purges. New equipment was being produced but wasn't fully deployed. Soviet forces in the western border regions were positioned for offensive operations, not defense, because Stalin didn't want to appear to expect a German attack. That might provoke the attack he was trying to avoid. It was circular reasoning of a particularly fatal kind. Soviet diplomacy in the 1920s and 1930s was characterized by flexibility unrestrained by principle. The Bolsheviks had started with the assumption that world revolution was imminent and that diplomacy was temporary. When revolution didn't materialize, they adapted. They cooperated with Weimar Germany while supporting German communists. They joined the League of Nations while maintaining the Comintern. They promoted collective security while conducting purges that weakened their military. They allied with Nazi Germany while claiming to oppose fascism. This pragmatism kept the Soviet Union alive through a dangerous period. The diplomatic isolation of the early 1920s was broken. The USSR gained international recognition, trading partners, and temporary security through the Nazi-Soviet pact. But the pragmatism came at enormous cost to the international communist movement, which was subordinated entirely to Soviet state interests and lost whatever independent moral authority it might have had. The two-track diplomacy, official relations plus revolutionary agitation, created lasting suspicion of Soviet intentions. Western governments never trusted Stalin, even when they were allied with him against Hitler during World War II, because they'd watched him operate for 2 decades with complete cynicism. Communist parties abroad lost credibility because they clearly took orders from Moscow and changed positions on command, regardless of local conditions or principles. The Nazi-Soviet pact was the culmination of this cynical diplomacy. It demonstrated that Stalin valued territorial expansion and temporary security over any ideological commitment to fighting fascism. It also demonstrated spectacularly bad judgment about Hitler's intentions. Stalin thought he'd bought time and security. What he'd actually done was give Hitler a free hand to conquer Western Europe without worrying about a two-front war, while positioning the Red Army badly for the German invasion that was coming. On June 22, 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union with over 3 million troops in the largest military operation in history. The non-aggression pact was worth exactly as much as Stalin's promises to the old Bolsheviks he'd shot, which is to say, nothing at all. The careful diplomacy, the territorial expansion, the attempts to buy security through deals with Hitler, all of it collapsed in a single morning as German forces smashed through Soviet border defenses. Stalin had spent the 1930s destroying his military leadership, terrorizing his population, and conducting foreign policy based on tactical convenience rather than strategic principle. Now he would face the consequences. The survival of the Soviet Union would depend on the resilience of the Soviet people, the resources mobilized through forced industrialization, and eventually the alliance with the Western democracies that Stalin had spent years distrusting. Now came the actual test of survival, and it would be far more brutal than any diplomatic negotiation. The Great Patriotic War was about to begin, and it would determine not just whether the Soviet Union survived, but what kind of power it would become if it did. At 4 a.m. on June 22, 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union with over 3 million troops, 3,600 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces and 2,500 aircraft. Operation Barbarossa, named after a medieval German emperor, because apparently Hitler thought historical references would make the invasion classier, was the largest military operation in human history. It was also supposed to be quick. German planners expected to defeat the Soviet Union in 6 to 8 weeks, which was optimistic considering the size of the country, but reflected German confidence after conquering most of Europe in less than 2 years. Stalin's response to the invasion was not what you'd call decisive leadership. According to various accounts, he was in denial for several days, refusing to believe that Hitler had actually attacked. This is the same Stalin who'd spent years conducting paranoid purges based on imaginary conspiracies. But now, when an actual invasion was happening, he convinced himself it must be a provocation by German generals acting without Hitler's authorization. The mental gymnastics required to believe this while German tanks were rolling across the border were impressive in a deeply unhelpful way. The Red Army was unprepared in ways that went beyond just military readiness. Stalin had ignored dozens of intelligence warnings. Richard Sorge, the Soviet spy in Japan, had sent the exact date of the invasion. Soviet deserters from the German army crossed over to warn of the coming attack. Stalin dismissed all of it as British propaganda designed to provoke war between Germany and the USSR. He was so committed to maintaining the non-aggression pact that he ordered Soviet forces not to respond to German provocations, which turned out to be excellent preparation for being invaded, in the sense that it made the invasion much easier for the Germans. Soviet forces in the western border regions were positioned badly. Many units were in the middle of reorganization. Equipment was scattered or not fully deployed. Air bases were crowded with aircraft parked in neat rows, which is great for inspection parades but terrible for surviving an air attack. In the first day of the invasion, the Luftwaffe destroyed about 1,200 Soviet aircraft, most of them on the ground. The Soviet Air Force essentially ceased to exist as an effective fighting force in the western USSR within hours. The German advance was devastating. Army Group North drove toward Leningrad. Army Group Center drove toward Moscow. Army Group South drove toward Ukraine. Soviet forces that tried to resist were encircled and destroyed. Within weeks, the Germans had advanced hundreds of kilometers and captured millions of Soviet soldiers. The encirclement battles were particularly catastrophic. Entire Soviet armies would be surrounded, cut off from supply and reinforcement, and forced to surrender or be annihilated. The Battle of Kiev in September 1941 resulted in over 600,000 Soviet prisoners taken. These weren't even battles in the traditional sense. They were massacres enabled by German tactical superiority and Soviet command confusion. Part of the problem was that Soviet military doctrine was offensive, not defensive. The Red Army was trained and organized to attack into Europe, not defend Soviet territory. When the Germans attacked first, Soviet commanders didn't know how to conduct defensive operations effectively. Orders from Moscow were often contradictory or out of touch with reality on the ground. Stalin kept ordering counterattacks against German forces that had already moved on, or demanding that encircled units break out when breaking out was no longer possible. It was micromanagement by someone who didn't understand the situation and wouldn't listen to people who did. The military disasters were compounded by political paranoia. Officers who retreated or lost battles were accused of treachery. Some were executed for failing to hold impossible positions. The NKVD operated behind the front lines, shooting deserters and anyone suspected of cowardice or defeatism. This created a situation where Soviet officers faced execution by their own side if they retreated, and annihilation by Germans if they stayed. Not exactly an environment that encourages flexible tactical thinking or honest reporting of battlefield conditions. Stalin disappeared from public view for about 2 weeks after the invasion. There are various theories about what he was doing: having a nervous breakdown, drinking heavily, paralyzed by the scale of the disaster he'd helped create by purging the military and trusting Hitler. When he finally addressed the nation by radio on July 3rd, he called the war the Great Patriotic War and appealed to Russian nationalism rather than communist ideology. He referred to brothers and sisters rather than comrades, invoked Russian military heroes from history, and emphasized defense of the homeland rather than defense of socialism. The shift from ideological to nationalist appeals was telling. Stalin understood that people would fight for Russia more readily than they'd fight for the Communist Party, especially after everything the Communist Party had done to them over the previous decade. The key to Soviet survival wasn't brilliant military strategy in 1941. It was depth, resources, and the willingness to trade space for time. The Soviet Union was enormous. Even with rapid German advances, there was still huge amounts of territory to retreat into. The Stalin regime had also industrialized frantically during the 1930s, and those factories could produce weapons even while retreating. The decision to evacuate industry eastward, beyond the Urals where German forces couldn't reach, was probably the single most important strategic decision of the war. The evacuation was a massive undertaking. Entire factories were disassembled, loaded onto trains, and moved east to the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia. Workers and their families went with the factories. Within months, these evacuated plants were reassembled and back in production, churning out tanks, aircraft, artillery, and ammunition far from the front lines. It was brutal. Workers lived in harsh conditions, worked long hours, survived on minimal rations, but it worked. By 1942, Soviet industrial production had recovered despite losing huge amounts of territory in the West. The brutality of the German occupation helped Soviet resistance more than any propaganda could. Hitler's plan for the Soviet Union was explicit genocide and colonization. Slavs were considered subhuman by Nazi ideology. The plan was to kill or enslave most of the population and colonize the territory with Germans. This wasn't hidden. German forces implemented it immediately. Mass executions of civilians, burning of villages, deliberate starvation of cities, murder of Jews, communists, and anyone who resisted. The German Soviet prisoners of war were treated with particular brutality. About 5.7 million Soviet soldiers were captured during the war. Of those, the Germans didn't consider Soviet prisoners protected by international conventions because the USSR hadn't signed the Geneva Convention on Prisoners of War. This was technically true but morally irrelevant. The Germans would have treated Soviet prisoners brutally regardless, because Nazi ideology considered them subhuman. The treatment of Soviet POWs was one of the Nazi regime's many war crimes, and it helped convince Soviet soldiers that surrender wasn't an option, because German captivity meant death anyway. Partisan warfare erupted behind German lines. Soviet partisans operated in forests and swamps, attacking German supply lines, ambushing patrols, sabotaging infrastructure. The partisan movement was partly organized by the Soviet government. The NKVD and Red Army sent organizers and supplies, but also partly spontaneous, as ordinary people decided that resisting German occupation was preferable to accepting it. Partisan warfare was brutal on all sides. Germans conducted reprisal operations, burning villages suspected of supporting partisans and executing civilians. Partisans attacked German installations and anyone they considered collaborators. It was guerrilla warfare at its most vicious. German forces had advanced to within sight of Moscow. They could see the Kremlin through binoculars, but they couldn't take the city. Soviet resistance stiffened. The weather turned brutally cold. German troops weren't equipped for winter warfare. They lacked proper winter clothing. Their vehicles and weapons froze in the cold, and their supply lines were overstretched. The Red Army, reinforced with troops from the east and better equipped for winter conditions, launched a counter-offensive in December 1941 that pushed German forces back from Moscow. The battle demonstrated that German victory wasn't inevitable. Hitler's generals had planned for a quick campaign before winter. When that failed, they weren't prepared for prolonged winter warfare. The Red Army, for all its problems, was at least designed to operate in Russian winter conditions. Soviet soldiers had winter clothing somewhat. Soviet equipment was designed for cold weather mostly, and Soviet commanders, despite the purges, understood winter warfare better than their German counterparts. The Germans learned that conquering the Soviet Union wasn't going to be a 6-week campaign followed by a victory parade. Leningrad, modern-day St. Petersburg, suffered the longest and most brutal siege of the war. German forces surrounded the city in September 1941 and maintained the siege until January 1944, nearly 900 days. Hitler ordered that Leningrad be starved into submission rather than taken by assault, which saved German casualties but killed hundreds of thousands of Soviet civilians. The city's population was trapped without adequate food supplies. The official ration in winter 1941-1942 was 125 grams of bread per day for civilians, about 4 slices. That was the official ration. Actual distribution was often less. People died of starvation by the thousands, then tens of thousands. During the worst months of winter, 1941-1942, the death rate in Leningrad reached about 100,000 people per month. Bodies lay in the streets because there was nobody with enough strength to bury them, and nowhere to bury them anyway because the ground was frozen. There are accounts of cannibalism, of people cutting flesh from corpses for food, of parents feeding children and then dying themselves. The siege of Leningrad was one of the greatest humanitarian disasters of the war, and it lasted nearly 3 years. The city survived partly through the Road of Life across frozen Lake Ladoga. During winter, trucks could drive across the ice to bring in supplies and evacuate civilians. During summer, boats carried supplies across the lake. It was never enough to prevent starvation, but it kept the city alive. Soviet forces also maintained a tenuous defensive perimeter that prevented German forces from completely cutting off the city. The siege was eventually broken in January 1943 when Soviet forces created a narrow land corridor to the city, though the full siege wasn't lifted until January 1944. Stalingrad was the turning point. The battle lasted from August 1942 to February 1943 and became the deadliest battle in human history. The Germans were driving toward the Caucasus to capture Soviet oil fields. Stalingrad on the Volga River was a major industrial city and a key transportation hub. Stalin ordered that the city bearing his name must not fall, which was typical Stalin logic. Symbolic value mattered more than strategic sense. The battle turned into house-to-house, room-to-room urban warfare. German and Soviet forces fought for individual buildings. The fighting was so close that opposing forces might occupy different floors of the same building. Soviet snipers operated from ruins, picking off German soldiers. German aircraft bombed the city to rubble, which paradoxically made it easier to defend because ruins provided cover and made German armour less effective. The civilian population was trapped in the middle, though many civilians had been evacuated before the battle reached its worst intensity. Soviet forces defended desperately, partly because they had no choice. NKVD units operated behind the lines, ready to shoot anyone who retreated without authorization, but also because the battle had become symbolic. Losing Stalingrad would have been a massive propaganda victory for Germany and a crushing blow to Soviet morale. Soviet reinforcements were ferried across the Volga River under German fire, suffering heavy casualties but maintaining the defense. The German forces were exhausted, their supply lines were extended, and they were fighting in urban terrain that negated many of their tactical advantages. This was in Operation Uranus, launched on November 19, 1942. Soviet forces attacked the Romanian armies protecting the German flanks north and south of Stalingrad. The Romanians, less well equipped and trained than German forces, collapsed. Soviet armoured units drove deep into German rear areas and linked up, encircling the entire German Sixth Army, about 300,000 troops trapped in and around Stalingrad. Hitler ordered Paulus to hold Stalingrad rather than break out. Göring promised that the Luftwaffe could supply the surrounded army by air, which was wildly optimistic given Soviet air defences and winter weather. The airlift failed. German forces in the pocket ran out of food, ammunition, and fuel. Temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Wounded soldiers froze to death because there was no medical supplies or heated shelter. The trapped German army disintegrated over 2 months of siege, finally surrendering in February 1943. Paulus was taken prisoner, the first German field marshal to surrender in German military history. About 91,000 German soldiers went into Soviet captivity. Only about 6,000 would survive to return to Germany after the war. Stalingrad was the psychological turning point of the war. Before Stalingrad, German forces had seemed invincible. After Stalingrad, Soviet forces knew they could defeat the Wehrmacht. The battle also demonstrated the effectiveness of Soviet operational planning. The encirclement of the Sixth Army was well executed and showed that the Red Army had learned from its disasters in 1941. Soviet commanders who survived the purges and the early defeats were becoming competent, experienced leaders. German commanders, meanwhile, were learning that Hitler's strategic decisions were increasingly detached from reality, and that following his orders could result in catastrophic defeats. The German defeat at Stalingrad was followed by the Battle of Kursk in summer 1943, the largest tank battle in history. The Germans launched an offensive against a Soviet salient near Kursk, hoping to encircle and destroy Soviet forces. Soviet intelligence knew the attack was coming, partially because the Germans were not subtle about their preparations, and partially because Soviet spies in Europe provided information about German plans. Soviet forces prepared defensive positions in depth and waited for the German attack. The German offensive began on July 5, 1943, and immediately ran into elaborate Soviet defences. Minefields destroyed German tanks. Anti-tank positions slowed German advances. Soviet artillery concentrated fire on German formations. The Germans made some progress, but at enormous cost. After about a week, Soviet forces launched their own counteroffensives, pushing German forces back. By August, Soviet forces had not only defeated the German offensive, but had begun their own advance westward. Kursk was significant because it demonstrated that the Red Army could defeat German forces even when the Germans chose the time and place of attack. German offensive capability was broken. From Kursk onward, the Red Army would be advancing and the Wehrmacht would be retreating, with only temporary exceptions. The strategic initiative had shifted permanently. The Soviet advance from 1943 to 1945 was brutal and costly, but ultimately irresistible. Soviet forces developed operational methods that combined massed artillery, armour and infantry in coordinated offensives that smashed through German defensive lines. Soviet industry was producing tanks, aircraft and artillery in massive quantities. American Lend-Lease aid provided trucks, food, raw materials and other supplies that helped Soviet logistics. Soviet forces had numerical superiority and were fighting on home territory with supply lines getting shorter as German supply lines got longer. The advance wasn't steady. German forces conducted skillful defensive operations that slowed Soviet progress and inflicted heavy casualties. but the overall direction was clear, westward toward Berlin. Soviet forces liberated Ukraine in 1943-1944, pushing German forces out of Soviet territory. In 1944, they drove into Poland, the Balkans, and eventually into Germany itself. By April 1945, Soviet forces were fighting in Berlin, taking the city street by street, building by building, until Hitler committed suicide in his bunker and Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 9, 1945. The human cost was staggering. The Soviet Union lost about 27 million people during the war, about 14% of the pre-war population. Of those, roughly 11 million were military deaths, and 16 million were civilian deaths, though the exact numbers are disputed and may never be known precisely. Entire villages were wiped out. Cities were destroyed. The Western Soviet Union, Belarus, Ukraine, Western Russia, was devastated. The Nazi occupation was deliberately murderous, and Soviet casualties reflected that brutality. The Soviet military suffered particularly heavy losses. The Red Army's casualties were about 11 million dead, with millions more wounded. Some of these losses were due to German military effectiveness, but many were due to Soviet tactical incompetence, especially in the early war years. Soviet commanders often launched frontal attacks against prepared German positions, accepting massive casualties to achieve objectives. This was brutally effective in the sense that it eventually overwhelmed German defences, but it was also tragic waste on a massive scale. Soviet women served in combat roles in unprecedented numbers. About 800,000 Soviet women served in the military, including as pilots, snipers, tank crews, and infantry. The famous Night Witches were female pilots who flew outdated biplanes on nighttime bombing raids against German positions. Female snipers operated at the front lines. Lyudmila Pavlichenko personally killed over 300 German soldiers, which is simultaneously impressive as marksmanship and horrifying as a measure of war's brutality. Soviet propaganda celebrated these women as heroes, which they were, while conveniently ignoring that their participation was partly necessary because so many Soviet men had been killed that women had to fill combat roles normally reserved for men. The partisan movement behind German lines grew throughout the war. By 1944, there were hundreds of thousands of partisans operating in German-occupied territory. They disrupted German supply lines, destroyed railways and bridges, gathered intelligence for the Red Army, and generally made German occupation expensive and difficult. German forces conducted brutal anti-partisan operations, which often meant massacring villages suspected of supporting partisans, which in turn created more partisans as survivors sought revenge. It was a vicious cycle that demonstrated how occupation creates resistance and resistance creates atrocities. Soviet victory came at cost beyond the immediate death toll. The war devastated Soviet infrastructure. About 70,000 villages and 700 cities and towns were destroyed. Industrial capacity in the Western USSR was wrecked. Factories destroyed, mines flooded, transportation infrastructure demolished. Agriculture was disrupted by the destruction of collective farms and the death of millions of agricultural workers. The Soviet Union would spend years rebuilding what the war had destroyed. The war also reinforced Stalin's dictatorship. During the war, Stalin's authority was absolute. Military commanders who failed were shot. Civilians who criticized the war effort were arrested. Entire ethnic groups were deported en masse because Stalin suspected them of potential collaboration with Germans. Chechens, Ingush, Crimean Tatars, and others were forcibly relocated to Kazakhstan or Siberia, with massive mortality during the deportations. The wartime justification for these deportations was dubious, but Stalin's paranoia about potential fifth columns and his willingness to punish entire peoples for the suspected disloyalty of individuals meant that hundreds of thousands of people died in deportations that served no military purpose. Victory in World War II became the defining myth of the Soviet Union. The Great Patriotic War was the proof that the Soviet system worked, that Soviet citizens would defend their homeland, that Stalin's leadership had been vindicated despite his catastrophic mistakes in 1941. Soviet propaganda emphasized the heroism of Soviet soldiers and the brilliance of Soviet strategy, while minimizing or ignoring the disasters of the early war, the massive casualties caused by Soviet tactical incompetence, and the crucial role of American and British aid through Lend-Lease. The victory also positioned the Soviet Union as one of two superpowers. Before the war, the USSR was a regional power that had been diplomatically isolated and militarily unproven. After the war, it occupied Eastern Europe, had the largest army in the world, and was recognized as one of the victors who would shape the post-war order. The Soviet Union went from pariah state to superpower in 4 years of the most brutal warfare in human history. Soviet forces occupied Eastern Europe as they advanced in 1944-1945. They liberated, or conquered depending on your perspective, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and the eastern portions of Germany and Austria. These territories would become Soviet satellites, with communist governments installed under Soviet supervision. The Iron Curtain was falling across Europe even before the war ended, though that wasn't fully clear until afterward. The war transformed Soviet society in ways that would shape the rest of Soviet history. A generation of Soviet men was decimated. There would be demographic imbalances for decades. The survivors were traumatized by years of brutal warfare. The population had experienced both German occupation and Soviet wartime policies, neither of which inspired much confidence in the benevolence of authority. But they'd also experienced victory, and that victory became central to Soviet identity. Stalin emerged from the war with his authority enhanced despite his catastrophic errors in preparing for and responding to the German invasion. The victory narrative emphasized Stalin's leadership while downplaying or hiding his mistakes. The cult of Stalin reached new heights. He was celebrated as the genius who'd led the Soviet Union to victory, conveniently ignoring that his purges had crippled the military and his diplomacy had failed to prevent the war. The cost of victory was so high that it shaped Soviet policy for decades. The Soviet Union would never again allow itself to be caught unprepared by invasion. The buffer zone of Eastern European satellites was meant to prevent future attacks on Soviet territory. Soviet military doctrine emphasized overwhelming force and defense in depth. The Soviet population's experience of German occupation and the devastating casualties of the war created a national trauma that influenced Soviet foreign policy throughout the Cold War. The Great Patriotic War was both the Soviet Union's greatest achievement and its greatest tragedy. The achievement was surviving Nazi Germany's attempt at genocide and colonial conquest. The tragedy was the 27 million dead, the devastated territory, the brutalized population. The war, it didn't prove that the Soviet system was good for its citizens. The casualties they suffered, partially due to Soviet incompetence and Stalin's paranoia, demonstrated that clearly enough. But it did prove that the system could survive an existential threat, which was enough to legitimize it for another 4 decades. Victory Day, May 9th, remained the most important Soviet and Russian holiday. It represented the moment when Soviet suffering was vindicated by victory. It was the proof that Soviet sacrifices meant something, that the dead hadn't died for nothing. The memory of the war became central to Soviet identity in ways that would outlast the Soviet Union itself. When the USSR collapsed in 1991, Victory Day survived as a Russian holiday, still celebrated with military parades and commemoration of the fallen. The war ended in Europe on May 9, 1945. Japan would surrender in August after Soviet forces invaded Manchuria, and the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Soviet Union had survived the greatest threat it would ever face. Now came the question of what kind of power it would become in the post-war world, and whether the alliance with America and Britain that had won the war would survive into the peace. The answer would define international relations for the next 4 decades. The alliance that defeated Nazi Germany lasted approximately 5 minutes after Germany surrendered, which might be a record for how quickly wartime allies can turn into peacetime rivals. By 1947, the United States and Soviet Union were engaged in a global confrontation that would define international relations for the next 4 decades. They never fought each other directly, hence Cold War rather than hot. But they competed everywhere else, turning the entire planet into a chessboard where proxy conflicts, espionage, propaganda, and the occasional nuclear threat substituted for actual combat between the superpowers. The seeds of the Cold War were planted even before World War II ended. The wartime conferences where Allied leaders met to discuss post-war arrangements revealed deep disagreements about what Europe should look like once Germany was defeated. These weren't minor diplomatic disputes about border adjustments. They were fundamental conflicts about political systems, spheres of influence, and whether Eastern Europe would be independent democracies or Soviet satellites. The Yalta Conference in February 1945 brought together Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin in the Crimean resort town of Yalta. Germany was still fighting but clearly losing. The main questions were how to finish the war, how to divide Germany after victory, and what would happen to the countries that Soviet forces were liberating, or occupying depending on your perspective, as they advanced westward. The conference produced agreements that looked reasonable on paper, but would prove worthless in practice because the three leaders had fundamentally different visions of post-war order. Stalin wanted security through control. His experience of German invasion, twice in 25 years, convinced him that Soviet security required controlling Eastern Europe as a buffer zone. Countries bordering the USSR needed to have friendly governments, and by friendly Stalin meant controlled by Moscow. The specifics could vary. Communist governments, coalition governments with communists in key positions, whatever worked. But the essential point was that Eastern Europe would be under Soviet influence. This wasn't ideological fervour about spreading communism. It was old-fashioned imperial security concerns dressed up in Marxist-Leninist language. Roosevelt and Churchill wanted something different. They talked about democracy, self-determination, and free elections in Eastern Europe. The Atlantic Charter, signed by Roosevelt and Churchill back in 1941, had proclaimed the right of all peoples to choose their own government. At Yalta, Stalin agreed to hold free elections in Poland and other Eastern European countries. This agreement was worth precisely as much as the paper it was written on, which wasn't much given that paper was scarce in post-war Europe anyway. The problem was that free elections in Eastern Europe would produce governments hostile to the Soviet Union, because Eastern Europeans generally weren't fans of Soviet occupation. Stalin understood this perfectly well, so the free elections that were eventually held were free in the sense that you could freely vote for the communist candidate, or freely not vote at all while being investigated by the secret police. Western leaders protested these rigged elections, but there wasn't much they could do about it short of going to war with the Soviet Union, which nobody wanted after just finishing a war with Germany. Poland became the test case for post-war arrangements. Poland had been the immediate cause of World War II, Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany to honour their alliance commitments, and the whole thing spiralled from there. The Polish government in exile, based in London, expected to return to Poland after the war and establish a democratic government. Stalin had other plans. He supported a communist-dominated government based in Lublin, which would be loyal to Moscow. At Yalta, the compromise was to create a coalition government including both groups. In practice, the communists systematically eliminated non-communist politicians from the coalition until Poland had a fully communist government by 1947. Poland's borders were also redrawn in ways that favoured Soviet interests. Eastern Poland, which the Soviet Union had annexed in 1939 after invading alongside Germany, stayed Soviet. Poland was compensated with German territory in the west. The eastern portions of Germany were given to Poland, and the German population was expelled. About 12 million Germans were forcibly moved westward in what remains one of the largest population transfers in history. This created a Poland that was dependent on Soviet protection to keep its new western territories, because Germany might someday want them back. It was clever power politics by Stalin, creating dependency through territorial arrangements. The Potsdam Conference in July-August 1945 was the last meeting of the Big Three, though it was really the Big 2.5 by that point. Churchill was replaced mid-conference by Clement Attlee after British elections. Stalin was the only original member still there, which gave him continuity advantage in negotiations. The conference dealt with the immediate administration of defeated Germany and reparations payments, but the atmosphere was already deteriorating as it became clear that the wartime alliance was fracturing. Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones: Soviet, American, British and French. Berlin, deep inside the Soviet zone, was also divided into 4 sectors. This arrangement was supposed to be temporary until a peace treaty could be negotiated and Germany reunified. It lasted 45 years instead, creating 2 separate German states and a divided Berlin that became the central symbol of the Cold War. The division of Germany wasn't inevitable in 1945, but it became inevitable as Soviet-Western relations deteriorated, and neither side was willing to accept a unified Germany under the other side's influence. Soviet occupation policy in Eastern Europe was systematic and brutal. Communist parties, backed by Soviet military presence and NKVD support, took control of governments through a combination of rigged elections, political intimidation, and outright coups. Opposition politicians were arrested, exiled, or murdered. Independent newspapers were shut down. Non-communist parties were banned or forced into subservience. By 1948, every country in Eastern Europe except Greece and Finland had a communist government aligned with Moscow. The methods varied by country but followed similar patterns. In Hungary, the communists initially participated in a coalition government, then gradually eliminated other parties until they held complete power by 1949. In Czechoslovakia, the communists staged a coup in February 1948, taking full control of the government and ending Czechoslovak democracy. Janma's defenestration as a political tool had a long history in Prague, and apparently the communists decided to maintain the tradition. Romania and Bulgaria got similar treatment, with communist parties using Soviet backing to eliminate opposition. Yugoslavia was a special case. The communists under Tito took power independently, having fought their own partisan war against German occupation. This meant Tito had his own power base and didn't need Soviet support, which would create problems for Stalin when Tito refused to follow Moscow's orders. But that comes later. The descent into Cold War was marked by a series of speeches and policy announcements that codified the new reality. Winston Churchill, no longer Prime Minister but still influential, gave a speech at Westminster College in Missouri in March 1946. The key line: "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent." The phrase Iron Curtain became the defining metaphor for the division of Europe. Churchill described how Soviet-controlled countries in Eastern Europe were cut off from the West, how free elections had been prevented, how communist police states were being established. Stalin was predictably unenthused about the speech, comparing Churchill to Hitler for supposedly trying to mobilize the West against the Soviet Union, which was typical Stalinist rhetoric. Anyone who criticized Soviet policy was either a fascist or a tool of fascists. The Truman Doctrine, announced in March 1947, committed the United States to supporting countries threatened by communist takeover. The immediate context was Greece and Turkey, where communist insurgencies were threatening existing governments. Truman asked Congress for $400 million in aid to these countries and declared that the United States would support free peoples resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. This was a fundamental shift in American foreign policy, from relative isolationism to global engagement in containing Soviet influence. The word containment would become central to American Cold War strategy. The goal wasn't to overthrow Soviet communism, but to prevent it from spreading further. The Marshall Plan, announced in June 1947, offered massive American economic aid to help Europe rebuild after the war. Secretary of State George Marshall proposed that the United States would provide financial assistance to any European country willing to participate in a coordinated recovery program. The offer technically included the Soviet Union and Eastern European countries, but it came with conditions that Stalin found unacceptable, primarily transparency about how the money would be used and coordination with Western European economies. Stalin refused to participate and prevented Eastern European countries from accepting Marshall Plan aid. He understood that accepting American aid would create economic ties to the West and reduce Soviet control over Eastern Europe. Instead, Stalin created the Molotov Plan, named after his foreign minister, which promised Soviet aid to Eastern European countries. The aid was minimal compared to the Marshall Plan because the Soviet Union was itself devastated by the war and didn't have resources to spare. The Molotov Plan was more about maintaining Soviet control than about economic development. It was followed in 1949 by the creation of Comecon, the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, which was supposed to coordinate economic planning among communist countries. In practice, it meant that Eastern European economies were organized to serve Soviet interests, providing raw materials and industrial goods to the USSR, often at below-market prices. The division of Europe was becoming institutionalized. Western European countries were rebuilding with American aid, developing democratic governments, and integrating their economies. Eastern European countries were under Soviet control, developing command economies, and becoming increasingly isolated from the West. The Iron Curtain wasn't just a metaphor, it was becoming a physical reality, with border fortifications, travel restrictions, and a widening gap in living standards between East and West. In June 1948, the Western powers introduced a new currency in their occupation zones of Germany, including West Berlin. This was a step toward creating a separate West German state. Stalin responded by blocking all ground access to West Berlin, cutting off road and rail links. Stalin's calculation was that the Western powers would either have to abandon West Berlin or negotiate on Soviet terms about the future of Germany. Instead, the Americans and British organized the Berlin Airlift. For nearly a year, Western aircraft flew supplies into West Berlin: food, fuel, medicine, everything needed to keep a city of 2 million people alive. At the peak, planes were landing in West Berlin every few minutes. The airlift West Berlin survived, Stalin backed down in May 1949 and lifted the blockade, and the crisis demonstrated Western resolve to maintain their position in Berlin. It also accelerated the division of Germany. The Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, was formally established in May 1949, and the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, was established in October 1949. Germany would remain divided for the next 40 years. The formation of military alliances completed the division of Europe into hostile camps. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was founded in April 1949 as a collective defense alliance. The core principle was Article 5. An attack on one member would be considered an attack on all. This meant that if the Soviet Union attacked any NATO member, it would be at war with the United States, which had nuclear weapons and had demonstrated at Hiroshima and Nagasaki that it was willing to use them. NATO wasn't purely defensive. It also served to integrate West Germany into Western defense structures and to maintain American military presence in Europe. But its primary purpose was deterring Soviet aggression. The Soviet response was the Warsaw Pact, established in 1955 as a military alliance of communist countries. The timing wasn't coincidental. West Germany joined NATO in 1955, which Stalin's successors used as justification for creating a formal communist military alliance. The Warsaw Pact included the Soviet Union, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, and East Germany. On paper, it was a defensive alliance similar to NATO. In practice, it was a mechanism for Soviet control over Eastern European militaries and would later be used to crush independence movements in Hungary and Czechoslovakia. While Europe was dividing into hostile blocs, events in Asia were creating new Cold War fronts. The Chinese Civil War ended in 1949 with communist victory. Mao Zedong's forces defeated the nationalist government, which fled to Taiwan. The People's Republic of China was established on October 1, 1949, creating the world's most populous communist country. Stalin had provided some support to the Chinese communists, but had also hedged his bets by maintaining relations with the nationalists. Mao wasn't particularly grateful for Stalin's lukewarm support, which would later contribute to the Sino-Soviet split. But in 1950, Stalin and Mao signed a treaty of friendship, alliance, and mutual assistance, creating what Western observers feared was a monolithic communist bloc stretching from Berlin to Beijing. The Korean War, starting in June 1950, was the first hot conflict of the Cold War. Korea had been divided at the 38th parallel after World War II, with Soviet forces occupying the north and American forces occupying the south. This was supposed to be temporary until elections could be held and Korea unified. Instead, two separate states emerged: Communist North Korea under Kim Il-sung and anti-communist South Korea under Syngman Rhee. Both claimed to be the legitimate government of all Korea. Both wanted to reunify the country by force. Kim Il-sung got Stalin's approval to invade South Korea. Stalin agreed, partly because he thought the Americans wouldn't intervene. They'd made statements suggesting South Korea wasn't part of their defense perimeter, and partly because he could use a Korean conflict to tie down American forces in Asia while he consolidated control in Europe. Stalin made sure he wouldn't be directly involved, Soviet forces wouldn't participate, and Soviet weapons would be provided through China. If the invasion failed, Stalin could distance himself from it. If it succeeded, he'd gain a unified communist Korea. The invasion began on June 25, 1950. North Korean forces pushed south rapidly, nearly conquering the entire peninsula. The United States intervened under UN auspices. The Soviet Union was boycotting the UN Security Council at the time over the exclusion of communist China, so they weren't present to veto the resolution authorizing UN intervention. American and Allied forces under General Douglas MacArthur landed at Incheon in September 1950 and pushed North Korean forces back across the 38th parallel. MacArthur then advanced into North Korea, driving toward the Chinese border. This prompted Chinese intervention in October 1950. Chinese volunteer forces crossed into Korea in massive numbers, pushing UN forces back south. The war fighting an armistice was finally signed in July 1953, creating a demilitarized zone along roughly the original border. Korea remained divided, and it remains divided today. The Korean War never officially ended with a peace treaty, just an armistice that suspended hostilities. The Korean War had several important consequences for the Cold War. It demonstrated that Cold War conflicts could turn hot quickly. It showed that neither superpower was willing to risk direct confrontation. Stalin provided weapons and advisors, but not Soviet forces, and the Americans limited their objectives to avoid triggering Soviet intervention. It also accelerated Western rearmament and the militarization of the Cold War. NATO expanded, defense budgets increased, and the assumption became that the Soviet Union was willing to use military force to expand communism, which needed to be met with military strength. The Korean War also revealed tensions within the communist bloc. Stalin had encouraged Kim's invasion, but then left North Korea to face the consequences when things went badly. Mao sent Chinese forces to save North Korea, but this wasn't primarily about communist solidarity. It was about preventing American forces from reaching the Chinese border. The relationship between Stalin, Mao, and Kim was complicated by national interests that didn't always align with ideological brotherhood. This would become more apparent after Stalin's death. The nuclear arms race intensified during the late 1940s and early 1950s. The United States had a monopoly on nuclear weapons from 1945 to 1949. This changed when the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb in August 1949, years earlier than American planners expected. The Soviet program had been accelerated by espionage. Klaus Fuchs, a German physicist working on the Manhattan Project, provided detailed information to Soviet intelligence about American bomb designs. This was effective espionage, but also demonstrated that Soviet scientists could build nuclear weapons with stolen blueprints and their own theoretical knowledge. Both superpowers then pursued thermonuclear weapons, hydrogen bombs far more powerful than the atomic bombs dropped on Japan. The United States tested the first hydrogen bomb in 1952. The Soviet Union tested one in 1953. The destructive power of these weapons was staggering, measured in megatons rather than kilotons, capable of destroying entire cities with a single bomb. The strategic implications were profound. Both superpowers now possessed weapons that could devastate the other, which created the paradoxical logic of mutual assured destruction. Direct war between the superpowers would result in both being destroyed, which meant that both had incentives to avoid direct conflict, while still competing globally through proxies, espionage, and influence operations. The development of intercontinental ballistic missiles in the late 1950s, rockets capable of delivering nuclear warheads across continents, completed the nuclear standoff. Both superpowers could now strike each other's homeland directly, with only minutes of warning time between launch and impact. This was strategically stabilizing in the perverse sense that neither side could eliminate the other's nuclear forces in a first strike, so both were deterred from starting a nuclear war. It was also terrifying because the possibility of accidental war or miscalculation was very real. Stalin died on March 5, 1953, though the Cold War he'd helped create would outlive him by nearly 4 decades. His death didn't end Soviet-American confrontation. If anything, it intensified as new Soviet leaders tried to prove their communist credentials, while also trying to avoid the worst of Stalin's paranoiac policies. The Cold War had become institutionalized in ways that transcended individual leaders. Military alliances, ideological commitments, bureaucratic interests, and genuine security concerns all combined to perpetuate the confrontation, even when neither side particularly wanted it. The division of Europe that had begun with wartime military advances and temporary occupation zones became permanent. The Iron Curtain became a physical barrier of fences, walls, minefields, and guard towers. Families were separated. Travel between East and West became nearly impossible for ordinary people. The economic gap widened as Western Europe prospered under democracy and market economics, while Eastern Europe stagnated under communist central planning. The Cold War's early years established patterns that would continue for decades. Superpower confrontation without direct war, competition through proxies and client states, arms races that consumed enormous resources, ideological warfare through propaganda and cultural exchanges, and the constant fear that some crisis would escalate into nuclear war. Both superpowers believed they were defending their legitimate security interests and promoting their political values. Both built alliances, developed sophisticated military capabilities, and prepared for a war that neither wanted but both feared. The transformation from World War II allies to Cold War adversaries had been remarkably rapid. In 1945, Soviet and American troops met at the Elbe River in Germany and celebrated their joint victory over Nazi Germany. By 1949, those same allies were on opposite sides of a divided Europe, building nuclear arsenals to threaten each other and preparing for a conflict that could destroy civilization. The wartime alliance had been a marriage of convenience against a common enemy. Once that enemy was defeated, the underlying tensions between communist dictatorship and capitalist democracy became impossible to ignore. The Cold War would continue to evolve through multiple phases, periods of heightened tension alternating with periods of cautious cooperation, crises that brought the superpowers to the brink of war, and eventually détente and arms control, as both sides recognized that unrestrained competition was unsustainable. But the basic structure established in the late 1940s, two hostile blocs, nuclear deterrence, competition across multiple domains from military to economic to cultural, would define international relations until the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The Soviet Union had survived the existential threat of Nazi invasion and emerged as a superpower. But the victory had come at enormous cost, and the security Stalin sought through control of Eastern Europe created new threats by alienating the Western powers and creating a global confrontation. The Soviet people, who had suffered through revolution, civil war, famine, purges, and the most brutal war in history, now faced decades of Cold War tension, military spending that consumed resources that might have improved living standards, and continued repression by a system that feared any loosening of control might lead to collapse. The division of the world into communist and capitalist blocs was in some ways more stable than the chaotic 1930s had been. The rules were clearer, the boundaries more defined, the mechanisms for managing crises better developed. But it was stability purchased at the price of perpetual confrontation, enormous military spending, and the constant possibility that some miscalculation or technical failure or desperate leader might trigger a nuclear war that would end human civilization. This was the world the Soviet Union helped create, and it would have to navigate that world while dealing with internal contradictions that would eventually prove fatal to the Soviet experiment itself. Stalin died on March 5, 1953, after suffering a stroke a few days earlier. He lay on. This was fitting, really. The man who'd ruled through terror spent his final hours being ignored because everyone was too afraid to help him. When doctors finally arrived, they were too frightened to provide proper treatment, because Stalin had recently arrested a bunch of doctors for supposedly plotting to poison Soviet leaders, which made being Stalin's doctor approximately as safe as being a bomb disposal technician with Parkinson's disease. The announcement of Stalin's death triggered an outpouring of public grief that was partly genuine. He was the leader who'd led the Soviet Union to victory in World War II, and partly performative, because not grieving sufficiently might suggest you were happy the dictator was dead, which could be unhealthy for your continued existence. Millions of people attended the funeral procession in Moscow. Several hundred were reportedly crushed to death in the crowds, which was a grimly appropriate final casualty count for Stalin's rule. Behind the scenes, the succession struggle began immediately. Nobody wanted another Stalin, at least nobody wanted another Stalin except themselves, so the initial arrangement was collective leadership. The key positions were divided among the top Soviet leaders. Georgy Malenkov became premier, Nikita Khrushchev became first secretary of the Communist Party, and Lavrenti Beria kept control of the security services. This was supposed to prevent any single person from accumulating the power Stalin had held. It lasted about 3 months before everyone realized that Beria needed to be eliminated before he eliminated them. Beria was the most feared man in the Soviet Union after Stalin. He'd run the NKVD and MVD, the secret police and internal security, for years. He knew where the bodies were buried, literally and figuratively, because he'd ordered many of them buried. He also knew everyone's secrets, which made him incredibly dangerous to his colleagues. After Stalin's death, Beria began positioning himself as a reformer. He released some political prisoners, stopped some arrests, and even suggested scaling back Soviet control in East Germany. This was partly genuine recognition that Stalin's terror policies were unsustainable, and partly calculated political positioning to build popular support. His colleagues were not fooled. They understood that Beria controlled the security apparatus and could use it against them the same way he'd used it against everyone else. In June 1953, Khrushchev and others organized a conspiracy to arrest Beria. The exact details remain murky. Soviet records from this period were deliberately obscured, but the basic outline is clear. Beria was summoned to a meeting of the Presidium, arrested by military officers loyal to Khrushchev's faction, and held in a military bunker. The elimination of Beria was significant because it established that post-Stalin leaders wouldn't use Stalin's methods against each other. They'd remove rivals through political maneuvering and maybe imprisonment or exile, but not through immediate execution. This was progress, in the sense that we only imprison our political rivals instead of shooting them, represents an improvement over we shoot everyone. The bar for civilized political behavior in the Soviet Union was not high. Khrushchev gradually outmaneuvered his rivals over the next few years. Malenkov was forced to resign as premier in 1955 and replaced by Nikolai Bulganin, who was more pliable. Molotov, Stalin's long-serving foreign minister, was increasingly sidelined. By 1956, Khrushchev was the dominant figure in Soviet leadership, though he never achieved Stalin's absolute power and had to maintain at least a pretense of collective decision-making. The defining moment of Khrushchev's rule came at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party in February 1956, when he delivered his secret speech denouncing Stalin's crimes. The speech was given in a closed session to party delegates, which was why it was called secret, though it was possibly the worst-kept secret in history, because everyone in the Soviet Union knew about it within weeks, and the full text was published in the West shortly after. In the speech, Khrushchev detailed Stalin's crimes, the purges, the cult of personality, the arbitrary arrests and executions, the bungling of military preparations before World War II, the deportations of entire ethnic groups. It was a comprehensive indictment of Stalin's rule, delivered by someone who had been one of Stalin's loyal subordinates, and had participated in many of the crimes he was now denouncing. The irony was not lost on listeners, though pointing out that irony publicly was still inadvisable. Khrushchev's motivations for the speech were complex. Partly it was genuine revulsion at Stalin's crimes. Khrushchev had witnessed the terror and knew people who'd been executed. Partly it was political calculation. By blaming Stalin for everything wrong with the Soviet system, Khrushchev could position himself as a reformer without questioning the system itself. The message was that the problem had been Stalin's personal dictatorship, not the Communist Party or Soviet socialism, which was a convenient way to avoid examining whether the system itself had created Stalin. The speech had enormous repercussions. In the Soviet Union, it triggered what became known as the Thaw, a partial liberalization of Soviet society. Some political prisoners were released from the Gulag. Censorship was relaxed slightly. Cultural life became less rigidly controlled. Writers and artists could explore themes that would have been impossible under Stalin, as long as they didn't directly challenge Communist Party rule. It was freedom with significant limitations. You could criticize Stalin, but not Lenin or Marxism-Leninism, or the party's leading role. Still, it was more freedom than had existed in decades. The de-Stalinization campaign included removing Stalin's name from cities, institutions, and monuments. Stalingrad became Volgograd in 1961. Stalin's body was removed from the mausoleum in Red Square where it had been displayed next to Lenin since 1953. Apparently the Soviet leadership decided one embalmed dictator was enough. Stalin's reputation was systematically dismantled, at least officially, though many Soviet citizens retained some admiration for him as the leader who'd won World War II. The selective memory was striking, remembering the victory while forgetting the purges, the famine, and the terror. Eastern Europe heard about the secret speech and took it as a signal that Soviet control might be loosening. This proved overly optimistic. In Poland in June 1956, workers in Poznan rioted over wages and conditions. The Polish communist leadership initially tried to suppress the protests with force, but then realized this might trigger Soviet intervention. Instead, they promoted Władysław Gomułka, a communist leader who'd been imprisoned during Stalin's purges and had some popular credibility to lead the Polish party. Gomułka promised reforms while maintaining Poland's alliance with the Soviet Union. Khrushchev accepted this arrangement. Poland could have some autonomy as long as it stayed in the Warsaw Pact and kept the Communist Party in power. Hungary was less fortunate. In October 1956, protests in Budapest escalated into a full-scale uprising against communist rule. Imre Nagy, who'd been appointed prime minister, announced political reforms including multi-party elections and Hungary's withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact. This was too much for Khrushchev. Reforming communist rule was one thing. Abandoning communism and leaving the Soviet alliance system was unacceptable. In November 1956, Soviet troops and tanks invaded Hungary, crushing the uprising. Nagy was captured, tried, and executed in 1958. The Hungarian Revolution demonstrated the limits of de-Stalinization. You could criticize Stalin, but you couldn't leave the Soviet bloc. While dealing with political turmoil, Khrushchev also pursued an ambitious program of domestic reform. His signature initiative was the Virgin Lands Campaign, launched in 1954 to bring vast areas of Kazakhstan and Siberia under cultivation. The idea was to solve Soviet agricultural problems by farming previously unused land. Hundreds of thousands of young volunteers, and many not-so-volunteers, were sent east to plough up the steppe and plant wheat. Initially, the program produced good harvests. Then soil erosion and poor farming practices led to declining yields. By the 1960s, the Virgin Lands were experiencing Dust Bowl conditions, which is what happens when you try to farm marginal land using questionable agricultural methods and Soviet central planning. But Khrushchev also promoted housing construction. Soviet cities were desperately overcrowded, with multiple families sharing single apartments. Khrushchev launched a massive building program to provide separate apartments for families. The buildings were cheap, ugly, and shoddily constructed. They became known as Khrushchevkas and were typically 5-story concrete blocks with minimal amenities. But they had separate kitchens and bathrooms, which was a significant improvement over communal apartments. Millions of Soviet families got their own living space for the first time, which genuinely improved quality of life, even if the construction quality was such that the buildings started deteriorating before they were finished being built. Soviet space achievements during Khrushchev's rule were spectacular propaganda victories. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, into orbit. This shocked the United States, which had assumed it led in technology. The fact that the Soviets could launch satellites meant they could launch nuclear warheads on intercontinental ballistic missiles, which rather alarmed American military planners. Sputnik triggered the space race and prompted massive American investment in science education and space technology, which was probably not what Khrushchev intended, but worked out well for American technological development. The Soviet space program followed up with a series of firsts. They sent the first animal into orbit, Laika the dog, in November 1957, though they didn't mention that Laika died within hours from overheating and stress, which wasn't great publicity for Soviet space technology. They crashed the first object into the moon in 1959. They photographed the far side of the moon the same year. And then, on April 12, 1961, they sent the first human into space, Yuri Gagarin, who completed one orbit of Earth and became an instant global celebrity. Gagarin's flight was a massive propaganda coup for the Soviet Union. Here was proof that Soviet technology and Soviet science could achieve things the Americans hadn't yet managed. Gagarin was perfect for the role, charming, photogenic, from a working-class background, and genuinely enthusiastic about spaceflight. He became the face of Soviet achievement, touring the world and meeting with leaders who wanted to meet the first man in space. The fact that his spacecraft was essentially uncontrollable, and he had to eject and parachute separately from the capsule during landing, a detail the Soviets concealed for years, didn't diminish the achievement. He'd been to space and returned alive, which was more than the Americans had done. The space program demonstrated that the Soviet Union could compete with and even surpass the United States in technological achievement. It suggested that the Soviet system of central planning and state investment could produce results that capitalist economies couldn't match. This was encouraging for Soviet citizens and worrying for American policymakers. The fact that the space program consumed enormous resources while Soviet citizens lived in Khrushchevkas and struggled to find basic consumer goods was less prominently advertised. Khrushchev's relationship with the West oscillated between confrontation and cautious cooperation. He pursued a policy called peaceful coexistence, the idea that communist and capitalist systems could compete without war, and communism would eventually win through superior economic performance rather than military conflict. This was a significant shift from Stalin's assumption that war with capitalism was inevitable. It also revealed Khrushchev's optimism about Soviet economic potential, which would prove unfounded but which drove his policies through the late 1950s and early 1960s. The Berlin crisis of 1958-1961 demonstrated that peaceful coexistence had limits. Berlin remained divided between East and West, with the border between East and West Berlin relatively porous. East Germans could travel to East Berlin and then cross into West Berlin, and from there to West Germany. This became an escape route for East Germans fleeing communist rule. By 1961, about 3 million people had left East Germany since 1949, including many skilled workers and professionals. This was both an economic disaster and a propaganda embarrassment for the communist regime. Khrushchev demanded that Western powers leave Berlin and allow it to become a free city under East German control. The Western powers refused. Khrushchev blustered and threatened but didn't want to risk war over Berlin. The East German government, led by Walter Ulbricht, had a simpler solution: build a wall. On August 13, 1961, East German forces began constructing barriers between East and West Berlin. What started as barbed wire fences quickly became a concrete wall with guard towers, minefields, and orders to shoot anyone attempting to cross. The Berlin Wall became the defining symbol of the Cold War's division. It was literally a wall built to keep people in, not to keep invaders out, but to prevent East Germans from leaving. The communist government called it the anti-fascist protection rampart, which was Orwellian branding at its finest. Everyone else called it what it was, a prison wall around East Germany. The wall would stand for 28 years, during which about 140 people would be killed trying to cross it. It demonstrated the fundamental weakness of communist rule. It couldn't compete with Western prosperity and had to use force to prevent people from leaving. The Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 brought the world closer to nuclear war than any event before or since. The crisis began when the Soviet Union began installing nuclear missiles in Cuba, which had become a communist state under Fidel Castro after the 1959 revolution. Castro was hostile to the United States, which had sponsored a failed invasion at the Bay of Pigs in 1961, and was receptive to Soviet military support. Khrushchev saw an opportunity to place nuclear missiles close to American territory, partially to protect Cuba from American invasion, but primarily to change the strategic balance. The United States had missiles in Turkey aimed at the Soviet Union, so why shouldn't the USSR have missiles in Cuba aimed at America? American U-2 spy planes photographed the missile installations in October 1962. President John F. Kennedy announced a naval blockade of Cuba to prevent further Soviet missiles from arriving. For 13 days, the world watched as the superpowers confronted each other. Soviet ships carrying missiles approached the blockade line. American forces prepared for invasion of Cuba. Nuclear forces on both sides were placed on high alert. The risk of miscalculation or accident triggering nuclear war was terrifyingly real. Both sides claimed victory. Khrushchev said he'd protected Cuba. Kennedy said he'd forced Soviet missiles out of the Western Hemisphere. In reality, both sides had been scared by how close they'd come to nuclear war and were relieved to find a face-saving compromise. The crisis led to better communications between Washington and Moscow, including the famous hotline that would allow direct communication during crises. It also demonstrated the dangers of nuclear brinksmanship and prompted both superpowers to pursue arms control negotiations. For Khrushchev, his colleagues, combined with growing economic problems and his erratic leadership style, the crisis damaged his standing within the Soviet leadership. Khrushchev's agricultural policies were failing. Despite the Virgin Lands campaign and various reforms, Soviet agriculture was producing inadequate harvests. The irony of the communist superpower buying grain from capitalist countries wasn't lost on anyone, though the Soviet press tried to frame it as a temporary difficulty caused by bad weather rather than systematic agricultural failure. Khrushchev's relationship with China deteriorated into open conflict. The Sino-Soviet split had been developing since the late 1950s as Mao Zedong rejected Khrushchev's de-Stalinization and peaceful coexistence policies. Mao thought Khrushchev was betraying revolutionary principles by criticizing Stalin and seeking accommodation with capitalism. Ideological disputes combined with traditional national rivalries, China and Russia had centuries of border disputes and mutual suspicion that communist ideology had papered over but not resolved. By the early 1960s, the split was open. Soviet advisors were withdrawn from China. Border disputes escalated. Chinese and Soviet communists published competing interpretations of Marxist-Leninist doctrine, each accusing the other of revisionism. The monolithic communist bloc that Western leaders had feared in the 1950s was fragmenting. This was good news for the West. A divided communist movement was less threatening than a united one, but it was terrible for Soviet prestige and for Khrushchev personally, who was blamed for mishandling relations with China. Khrushchev's governing style became increasingly erratic. He reorganized government ministries, then reorganized them again. He split the Communist Party into industrial and agricultural wings, creating administrative chaos. He made impulsive decisions and announced dramatic policy changes without consulting colleagues. He gave rambling speeches and engaged in embarrassing public behavior, famously banging his shoe on the desk at the United Nations in 1960, which became an enduring symbol of Soviet belligerence, even though accounts differ on whether he actually banged the shoe or just waved it. His colleagues had had enough. In October 1964, while Khrushchev was vacationing in the Crimea, the Presidium met and voted to remove him from power. He was summoned back to Moscow and confronted with a list of accusations: mishandling agriculture, antagonizing China, adventurism in foreign policy, creating the Cuban Missile Crisis, disorganizing the party and government with constant reforms. He was forced to retire, officially for reasons of age and health. Unlike Stalin's victims, he wasn't arrested or executed. He was given a pension and a dacha, and allowed to live quietly until his death in 1971. This was genuine progress in Soviet political culture. You could lose power without losing your life. Khrushchev's era was characterized by contradictions. He denounced Stalin's crimes while having participated in them. He promoted reform while maintaining one-party dictatorship. He sought peaceful coexistence while building nuclear missiles and threatening Berlin. He freed political prisoners while crushing the Hungarian uprising. He promoted Soviet achievements in space while presiding over agricultural failures that required buying grain from capitalist countries. The thaw he initiated was real but limited. Soviet society became less terrorized, more open, marginally more prosperous. But it remained a dictatorship where political dissent was punished, where the KGB monitored citizens, where the Communist Party controlled all aspects of life. The improvements were relative to Stalin's terror, which set a very low bar. Compared to Western democracies, Soviet life remained constrained, impoverished, and repressive. Khrushchev, his greatest failure was probably believing that Soviet socialism could outperform Western capitalism if only Stalin's mistakes were corrected. The problems with Soviet socialism went deeper than Stalin's personal dictatorship, though Khrushchev never acknowledged this and probably never understood it. He believed in the system and thought it could be reformed and improved. His successors would be less optimistic, more cynical, and ultimately more concerned with preserving stability than with pursuing reform. The space achievements of the Khrushchev era demonstrated Soviet technological capabilities, but couldn't mask underlying economic problems. The Soviet Union could launch satellites and send men into space, but it struggled to produce enough food to feed its population or consumer goods to satisfy citizens' basic needs. This contradiction, spectacular achievements in some areas combined with persistent failures in others, would characterize Soviet development for the rest of its existence. Khrushchev's removal marked the end of post-Stalin reform efforts. His successors would focus on stability rather than change, on preserving what they had rather than trying to improve it. The dynamic, chaotic, sometimes promising Khrushchev years gave way to the stagnant, cautious, increasingly cynical Brezhnev years. That hope would gradually fade as it became clear that the system was incapable of fundamental reform without ceasing to be Soviet. The Khrushchev era showed both the possibility and the limits of reform within the Soviet system. You could acknowledge past crimes, release political prisoners, allow some cultural freedom, and pursue ambitious projects in space and housing. But you couldn't question one-party rule, allow genuine political opposition, or permit the kind of economic freedom that might threaten central planning. The reforms that were possible weren't enough to make the system work well. The reforms that might have made it work better weren't possible without undermining the system itself. This dilemma would eventually prove fatal to Soviet socialism, but that realization was still decades away in 1964. Leonid Brezhnev came to power in October 1964 as part of the collective leadership that removed Khrushchev. He was chosen partly because he seemed safe and unambitious, a bureaucrat who could be controlled by his colleagues. This assessment turned out to be wrong, but it took a while for everyone to realize it because Brezhnev operated slowly and carefully, accumulating power through patronage and patience rather than through dramatic purges or policy announcements. By the early 1970s, he was the undisputed leader of the Soviet Union, and he would remain so until his death in 1982, giving the Soviet Union its longest period of stable leadership since before the revolution. The Brezhnev era became known as the period of stagnation, though this label wasn't used officially until after Brezhnev died, and his successors needed to explain why everything was terrible. During the actual Brezhnev years, the official line was that the USSR was building developed socialism and achieving steady progress toward communism, which was the kind of ideological doublespeak that everyone learned to ignore while nodding along at party meetings. The unspoken deal of the Brezhnev era was stability in exchange for stagnation. The leadership wouldn't pursue disruptive reforms that might threaten the system or anyone's position. In return, they wouldn't pursue dramatic improvements that might actually help Soviet citizens but would require taking risks. It was a comfortable arrangement for the bureaucracy, and deeply frustrating for anyone who thought the Soviet Union should be more than a slightly shabby superpower, running on momentum from past achievements. Brezhnev reversed many of Khrushchev's reforms. The party was reunified. Khrushchev's split between industrial and agricultural branches was abandoned. The economic ministries were reorganized back to their pre-Khrushchev structure. Cultural controls were tightened. The thaw was over, and artists and writers were expected to celebrate Soviet achievements rather than explore uncomfortable truths. The message was clear: no more experiments, no more dramatic changes, no more rocking the boat. The boat would continue sailing in whatever direction it was already going, which happened to be in circles, but at least they were stable circles. The rehabilitation of Stalin's reputation began tentatively during the Brezhnev years. Stalin wasn't officially praised, that would be too obvious, but criticism of him faded from public discourse. His role in winning World War II was emphasized while his crimes were minimized or ignored. By the 1970s, some Soviet officials were quietly arguing that maybe Stalin hadn't been so bad after all, that his methods had been necessary for the times, that Khrushchev's criticism had been excessive. This revisionism reflected the conservative nature of Brezhnev's regime, which was more comfortable with Stalin's authoritarianism than with Khrushchev's erratic reformism. The Soviet economy during the Brezhnev era operated on a principle that might be called perpetual adequacy at mediocrity. There was enough of everything to prevent crisis, but not enough to create prosperity. Stores had food, but not the food you wanted. Factories produced goods, but not goods that worked well. Housing was available, but you'd wait years for an apartment and then live in a building constructed with such corner cutting that the corners were practically non-existent. The system generated impressive statistics: tons of steel produced, kilometers of pipeline laid, cubic meters of concrete poured, while failing to produce the consumer goods and services that might make Soviet citizens' lives actually comfortable. The oil boom of the 1970s temporarily masked these economic problems. Global oil prices quadrupled after the 1973 Arab-Israeli War and subsequent oil embargo. The Soviet Union was one of the world's largest oil producers, and suddenly it had enormous revenues from oil exports. This windfall allowed the Soviet government to import grain from the West to compensate for agricultural failures, to buy consumer goods to reduce popular discontent, and to fund military build-ups and foreign adventures. It was like the agricultural sector remained a disaster throughout the Brezhnev era. Despite the collective central planning created bizarre situations where farms growing tomatoes might be hundreds of kilometers from factories making tomato sauce, because the planners in Moscow who allocated resources weren't particularly concerned with logistics. Food rotted in warehouses or never made it from farms to cities, because the distribution system was designed by people who'd never heard of just-in-time delivery and wouldn't have understood it if they had. The one bright spot in Soviet agriculture was the private plots that collective farm workers were allowed to maintain. These tiny plots, usually less than an acre, produced a disproportionate share of Soviet fruit, vegetables and meat, despite representing a tiny fraction of agricultural land. Instead, they tolerated private plots as a necessary evil, while continuing to organize the vast majority of agriculture in ways that guaranteed inefficiency. The consumer economy operated increasingly through informal networks rather than official state stores. If you wanted something, good quality shoes, imported electronics, fresh meat, decent furniture, you didn't go to a state store and buy it. You cultivated connections, accumulated favors, and traded through informal networks called blat. Everyone participated in this system at some level. Factory doctors expected gifts from patients who wanted good treatment. Store clerks held back desirable goods for friends and relatives, or sold them for extra payment under the table. It was systematic corruption so pervasive that it became the actual economic system, with the official planned economy serving mainly as a facade. The shadow underground factories produced consumer goods using stolen materials and unauthorized labor. Private entrepreneurs operated illegal businesses, from taxi services to small manufacturing. The line between informal economy and organized crime was blurry, and party officials often participated in or protected shadow economy operations in exchange for kickbacks. The corruption extended to the highest levels. Brezhnev's family was notoriously corrupt. His daughter Galina's husband ran what amounted to a crime ring involving theft of diamonds and other valuables, protection rackets, and connections to the criminal underworld. When this was eventually investigated after Brezhnev's death, the scale of corruption was stunning. Millions of rubles stolen, evidence of involvement by high-level officials, connections between party leadership and organized crime. But during Brezhnev's lifetime, he protected his family and their associates, which sent a clear signal that corruption was acceptable as long as you were connected to the right people. The cult of personality around Brezhnev grew to absurd proportions. He received numerous awards and honors, including 4 Hero of the Soviet Union medals, the highest military honor, despite his relatively minor role in World War II. He was given the Lenin Prize for literature for his memoirs, which were ghost-written and weren't particularly good even by the charitable standards applied to political memoirs. His portrait appeared everywhere. His speeches were published and studied, even though they were generally dull recitations of party-line positions. None of this fooled Soviet citizens who joked bitterly about Brezhnev's incompetence and vanity, but the cult persisted because criticizing it publicly was dangerous. Dissent became more organized during the Brezhnev era, even as repression became more systematic. The human dissidents like Andrei Sakharov, a physicist who'd helped develop Soviet nuclear weapons, and Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the writer whose novels exposed the Gulag system, became internationally known critics of Soviet repression. They weren't calling for the overthrow of communism, at least initially. They were calling for the Soviet government to follow its own laws and constitution, which guaranteed rights that were systematically violated in practice. The KGB developed sophisticated methods for dealing with dissent without creating the kind of mass terror that Stalin had employed. Instead of shooting dissidents, they were arrested on fabricated charges, tried in closed courts, and sentenced to labor camps or psychiatric hospitals. The psychiatric hospital approach was particularly cynical. Dissidents were diagnosed with invented mental illnesses like sluggish schizophrenia, which supposedly manifested as anti-Soviet views and required involuntary treatment with powerful psychotropic drugs. This allowed Solzhenitsyn published The Gulag Archipelago in 1973, a massive documentation of the Soviet camp system based on survivor testimony and his own experiences. The book was published in the West and smuggled back into the Soviet Union in samizdat. Self-published underground copies that circulated hand-to-hand. The Soviet government couldn't suppress it entirely, so in 1974 they arrested Solzhenitsyn, stripped him of Soviet citizenship and deported him. This was the new approach to prominent dissidents, expulsion rather than execution, which avoided making martyrs while removing troublesome critics. Sakharov, as a nuclear physicist who knew state secrets, couldn't be expelled without risking intelligence leaks. So he was harassed, placed under surveillance, and eventually exiled internally to the closed city of Gorky in 1980, where he remained under house arrest until Gorbachev released him in 1986. The treatment of Sakharov, a man who'd contributed enormously to Soviet military power but who demanded basic human rights, demonstrated the Soviet leadership's priorities. Loyalty to the system mattered more than achievement, and dissent was unforgivable regardless of past service. The Czechoslovak crisis of 1968 showed that the Soviet leadership would use force to maintain control over Eastern Europe. Czechoslovakia under Alexander Dubček had begun implementing reforms, loosening censorship, allowing some political pluralism, reducing the Communist Party's monopoly on power. This was in August 1968, Warsaw Pact forces invaded Czechoslovakia with about 500,000 troops. The invasion was swift and brutal. The invasion produced the Brezhnev Doctrine, which stated that socialist countries had limited sovereignty. If socialism was threatened in any Warsaw Pact country, the Soviet Union and its allies had the right to intervene. This was basically announcing that Eastern European countries could do whatever they wanted as long as they didn't threaten Communist Party rule or try to leave the Soviet alliance system, which wasn't much freedom at all. The doctrine would be applied again when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979, though with considerably worse results. Despite the invasion of Czechoslovakia, the early 1970s saw a period of détente, reduced tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States. Both superpowers had reasons to pursue better relations. The United States was bogged down in Vietnam and wanted to reduce Cold War tensions. The Soviet Union wanted to reduce military spending and increase trade with the West. China had split with the Soviet Union and was opening relations with the United States, which made Soviet leaders nervous about being isolated. And both superpowers were genuinely worried about nuclear war and wanted to reduce the risk through arms control. The Strategic Arms Limitation talks produced the SALT-I Treaty in 1972, limiting anti-ballistic missile systems and freezing the number of strategic nuclear weapons at current levels. This didn't reduce the massive nuclear arsenals both sides had built, it just prevented them from growing even larger. But it was progress, in the sense that agreeing not to make things worse counts as progress when the alternative is making them much worse. Nixon's visit to Moscow in 1972 and Brezhnev's visit to Washington in 1973 symbolized the détente period. The two leaders met, signed agreements, and projected images of cooperation. Trade between the Soviet Union and the United States increased. Cultural exchanges expanded. There was talk of a new era of peaceful coexistence based on mutual recognition and restraint. Soviet leaders hoped that détente would give them access to Western technology and credits, while maintaining their control over Eastern Europe and avoiding domestic reforms. The Helsinki Accords of 1975 seemed to confirm Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe in exchange for promises about human rights. The Accords recognized existing European borders, meaning Western countries accepted Soviet control over Eastern Europe, in exchange for Soviet promises to respect human rights and fundamental freedoms. The Soviet leadership thought this was a good deal. They got legitimacy for their sphere of influence in exchange for promises they had no intention of keeping. What they hadn't anticipated was that Helsinki monitoring groups would form in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, documenting human rights violations and demanding that governments honour their Helsinki commitments. The human rights provisions they thought were meaningless propaganda would eventually help undermine communist legitimacy. Détente began collapsing in the late 1970s. The Soviet Union continued building up military forces despite arms control agreements. Soviet involvement in conflicts in Africa and Asia, supporting communist movements in Angola, Ethiopia and elsewhere, convinced American hawks that détente was one-sided, with the Soviets continuing aggressive expansion while the Americans showed restraint. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979 effectively ended détente and began what some called the Second Cold War. Afghanistan had a communist government after a 1978 coup, but the government faced widespread resistance from Islamic insurgents. The Afghan communists asked for Soviet military support. So in December 1979, Soviet forces invaded Afghanistan, killed the Afghan leader they'd come to support, installed a new leader, and prepared to crush the resistance quickly. The resistance didn't crush quickly. It fought back effectively using guerrilla tactics, knowledge of local terrain, and eventually massive military aid from the United States, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and other countries opposed to Soviet expansion. What was supposed to be a brief intervention to stabilize a client state turned into a decade-long war that killed over 14,000 Soviet soldiers and accomplished nothing except demonstrating that the Soviet military couldn't defeat determined insurgents fighting on their own territory with external support. The Afghan war was politically disastrous. Within the Soviet Union, the war created growing dissatisfaction as casualties mounted, and it became clear there was no victory in sight. Soviet soldiers returned traumatized and cynical, having fought in a war they didn't understand for objectives that were never clearly defined. The war drained resources that could have been used for economic development and consumed political capital that the Soviet leadership could ill afford to lose. The economic problems that oil revenues had masked in the 1970s became increasingly apparent by the early 1980s. Growth rates declined. Productivity stagnated. Technology lagged behind the West. The Soviet Union was still producing mainframe computers, while Western countries were developing personal computers. Consumer goods remained scarce and low quality. The generational divide became stark. The Soviet leadership was increasingly elderly and out of touch. Meanwhile, younger Soviet citizens saw the gap between propaganda about Soviet achievements and the reality of daily life characterized by shortages, corruption, and stagnation. The contrast with the West became harder to ignore. The technological gap was particularly worrying for Soviet leaders. The computer revolution was transforming Western economies and militaries, while the Soviet Union struggled to produce reliable technology. The centralized planning system that had worked reasonably well for building steel mills was terrible at promoting innovation in information technology. Command economies can mobilize resources for specific goals, but they're bad at the kind of decentralized experimentation and rapid adaptation that characterized the computer industry. The social problems proliferated. Alcoholism was endemic. Soviet per capita alcohol consumption was among the highest in the world, partly because vodka was more available than consumer goods, and partly because drinking was a rational response to the bleakness of Soviet life. Life expectancy began declining in the 1970s, which almost never happens in developed countries and indicated serious public health problems. Infant mortality rates remained stubbornly high. The healthcare system, which was officially free and universal, was actually a two-tier system where quality care required bribes and connections, while ordinary citizens got inadequate treatment in underfunded facilities. Soviet industry operated without meaningful environmental controls. Air quality in industrial cities was terrible. Nuclear facilities disposed of waste carelessly. The full extent of contamination wouldn't be known until after the Soviet collapse, but it was substantial. The Aral Sea began shrinking dramatically due to irrigation projects that diverted its water sources, eventually losing about 90% of its volume and creating an environmental disaster. Economic planning focused on production quotas without considering environmental or health impacts, because those weren't measured in the statistics that determined whether you met your targets. The Brezhnev era's unofficial motto might have been, "We pretend to work and they pretend to pay us," a joke that captured the pervasive cynicism about Soviet economic life. Workers knew their jobs were often pointless make-work. Managers knew they were supposed to meet impossible quotas and that creative accounting was expected. Everyone knew the propaganda was lies, but everyone repeated it because not repeating it was dangerous. It was a society built on mutual pretense, where the gap between official reality and actual reality had become so wide that both existed simultaneously without apparent contradiction. By the time Brezhnev died in November 1982, the Soviet Union was in crisis, though not everyone recognized it yet. The economy was stagnating but not collapsing. Society was cynical but not rebellious. The military was powerful but overstretched in Afghanistan. The leadership was elderly and conservative but still in control. The system worked badly, but it still worked, and there were no obvious alternatives that wouldn't threaten the entire structure of Soviet power. Brezhnev, his body was displayed, leaders from around the world attended, speeches praised his achievements, and he was buried in the Kremlin wall near Lenin's mausoleum. Within a few years, his era would be widely condemned as the period of stagnation. His policies would be blamed for the problems his successors inherited. His cult of personality would be dismantled as completely as Stalin's had been. But at his funeral, the official line was that he'd led the Soviet Union to new heights of socialist achievement, which tells you everything you need to know about the reliability of official Soviet narratives. The Brezhnev era had maintained stability at the cost of dynamism. It had avoided crisis by avoiding change. The younger generation of Soviet leaders who had come to power after Brezhnev, men like Gorbachev who'd witnessed the stagnation and understood that it couldn't continue, would attempt reforms that they thought would revive the Soviet system. Instead, those reforms would expose how fragile the entire structure had become, how much it depended on coercion and control rather than genuine support or effectiveness. The Brezhnev consensus, stability at any cost, had purchased 2 decades of relative calm at the price of storing up problems that would prove unsolvable within the existing Soviet framework. But that realization was still a few years away in 1982. For now, the Soviet Union continued its familiar routine, pretending to be a dynamic superpower while actually being a declining empire, maintaining the facade of ideological confidence while privately doubting everything, claiming achievements while sliding toward irrelevance. The long, slow decline was becoming impossible to ignore, but nobody yet knew how to stop it without destroying the system itself. After Brezhnev died in 1982, the Soviet Union experienced what might be called the geriatric interlude. Yuri Andropov, former KGB chief, took power and lasted 15 months before dying of kidney failure. Konstantin Chernenko, Brezhnev's old crony who was already seriously ill when appointed, lasted 13 months before dying of emphysema and heart failure. The Soviet leadership was quite literally dying in office, which was awkward for a country that claimed to represent humanity's future, but couldn't keep its leaders alive long enough to finish a term. The joke circulating in Moscow was that you should buy season tickets to Kremlin funerals because they were becoming regular events. On March 11, 1985, the Politburo finally appointed someone who wasn't on death's doorstep. Mikhail Gorbachev, age 54, which made him practically a teenager by Soviet leadership standards. Gorbachev's initial approach was cautious reform. He launched a campaign against alcoholism, restricting vodka sales and promoting anti-drinking propaganda. This was deeply unpopular. Russians have historically viewed vodka consumption as a fundamental human right, and largely ineffective because people just made moonshine at home or drank industrial alcohol, which was considerably more dangerous than legal vodka. The real changes began with glasnost, openness. Gorbachev believed that public discussion of problems would help identify solutions and build support for reforms. Soviet media was allowed to report on issues that had previously been censored: corruption, economic problems, environmental damage, even criticisms of government policy. Newspaper, television showed documentaries about social problems. Historical archives were opened, revealing truths about Soviet history that had been suppressed for decades. Suddenly you could read about Stalin's crimes in mainstream newspapers. You could watch debates on television where people openly criticized government policies. You could attend meetings where speakers denounced corruption and incompetence. The problem, and Gorbachev would recognize this too late, was that once you started allowing people to discuss some problems, they wanted to discuss all problems, including whether the Communist Party should have a monopoly on power and whether the Soviet Union should exist at all. The revelations about Soviet history were particularly devastating. The full extent of Stalin's purges was documented. The secret protocols of the Nazi-Soviet Pact, which the Soviet government had denied for decades, were published. The truth about events like the Katyn massacre, where Soviet forces murdered thousands of Polish officers in 1940 and blamed it on the Germans, was finally acknowledged. Each revelation undermined the legitimacy of Soviet power, which had been built on lies and maintained through censorship. Gorbachev thought truth would strengthen the system by exposing past mistakes. Instead, perestroika. The goal was to make the Soviet economy more efficient and innovative while maintaining socialist principles and party control. Private businesses were legal but operated in an uncertain regulatory environment where they could be shut down arbitrarily. Factory autonomy meant factories pursued their own interests rather than coordinating with the overall economy, which was fine if your goal was chaos, but less fine if you wanted functioning supply chains. Partially freeing prices while maintaining state control over production created shortages and inflation simultaneously, which is quite an achievement in failed economic policy. The Chernobyl disaster on April 26, 1986 became a symbol of everything wrong with the Soviet system. A nuclear reactor at the Chernobyl power plant in Ukraine exploded during a safety test, releasing massive amounts of radiation. The initial Soviet response was to lie about it. Authorities denied anything serious had happened, even as radiation detectors in Sweden picked up contamination, and Swedish authorities asked Moscow what had exploded. Soviet citizens in nearby areas weren't warned or evacuated immediately because admitting the disaster would be embarrassing. The May Day parade in Kiev went ahead as scheduled, with children marching while radioactive particles fell on them, because cancelling the parade might cause panic or suggest the government couldn't protect its citizens. Eventually, the truth couldn't be contained. The reactor burned for days, releasing radiation across Ukraine, Belarus, and parts of Europe. About 350,000 people were eventually evacuated from contaminated areas. The long-term health effects, increased cancer rates, birth defects, environmental contamination, would last for generations. The economic cost was enormous. The political cost was perhaps even greater. Chernobyl demonstrated that the Soviet system would lie to its own citizens about immediate threats to their health and safety, that it valued propaganda over people's lives, that it couldn't manage its own technology safely. Gorbachev himself later said that Chernobyl was a turning point that convinced him the system needed fundamental reform. The disaster exposed the culture of lies, the incompetence, the willingness to sacrifice citizens to avoid admitting mistakes. It showed that glasnost wasn't just nice to have, it was necessary to prevent disasters caused by cover-ups and denial. But Chernobyl also demonstrated that the problems went deeper than Gorbachev's reforms could fix. You couldn't fix a system built on lies by telling a few truths. You couldn't make a fundamentally broken system work by adjusting some parameters. Foreign policy under Gorbachev changed dramatically. He recognized that the Soviet Union couldn't afford the Cold War anymore. The arms race was consuming resources needed for economic development. The Afghan war was a bleeding wound that needed to be closed. The Eastern European Empire was expensive to maintain and increasingly restive. Gorbachev's solution was what he called new thinking, reducing military confrontation, pursuing arms control agreements, allowing Eastern European countries more autonomy, and generally trying to reduce Soviet commitments so resources could be redirected to domestic reforms. The negotiations with the United States produced dramatic results. The INF Treaty in 1987 eliminated an entire class of nuclear missiles. START agreements reduced strategic nuclear arsenals. Gorbachev and Reagan, then Gorbachev and George H.W. Bush, developed relatively positive working relationships. The Cold War thaw accelerated so quickly that some Western leaders were suspicious. Surely the Soviets were plotting something, because why else would they be so cooperative? The answer was that the Soviet Union was broke and desperate, but that took a while to become apparent. The withdrawal from Afghanistan was announced in 1988 and completed in February 1989. The war had killed over 14,000 Soviet soldiers, wounded tens of thousands more, and left Afghanistan in ruins. The Soviet-backed government would collapse shortly after Soviet withdrawal, and Afghanistan would descend into civil war that eventually brought the Taliban to power. The whole adventure had been pointless, expensive, and demoralizing, which was unfortunately typical of Soviet foreign policy adventures. Eastern Europe was where Gorbachev's reforms produced the most dramatic and unexpected results. He announced that the Soviet Union would no longer use force to maintain communist governments in Eastern Europe. The Brezhnev Doctrine was dead. Eastern European countries could choose their own paths, their own reforms, their own governments. This was meant to allow reform communism to emerge in Eastern Europe, communist governments that would be more flexible and popular while remaining socialist and allied with Moscow. What actually happened was that Eastern Europeans, given the choice, chose to abandon communism entirely. Poland led the way. The Solidarity trade union, which had been suppressed in the early 1980s, was legalized in 1989. By August, the transition was remarkably peaceful. The Polish Communist Party essentially negotiated itself out of power because it recognized that maintaining power by force without Soviet backing was impossible. Hungary followed a similar path, opening its border with Austria in May 1989. This created an escape route for East Germans, who could travel to Hungary and then cross into Austria and West Germany. The Berlin Wall, built to keep East Germans in, was being circumvented by people leaving through other routes. The fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9, 1989, was one of those historical moments that happened almost accidentally. East Germany announced new travel regulations that were supposed to make it slightly easier to visit West Berlin. East Berliners rushed to the checkpoints demanding to cross. Border guards, receiving no clear instructions and watching crowds building, opened the gates. People poured through, climbing on the wall, taking hammers and chisels to break off pieces. The wall that had symbolized Cold War division for 28 years was breached, and within months it would be demolished. The collapse of communism spread across Eastern Europe in what was called the Autumn of Nations. Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution in November 1989 peacefully overthrew the communist government. Bulgaria's communist leadership resigned. Romania's revolution was violent. Dictator Nicolae Ceausescu tried to maintain power by force, but the army switched sides and he was captured and executed on Christmas Day 1989. By the end of 1989, every Eastern European communist government except Albania's had fallen or was in the process of collapsing. Gorbachev could have sent Soviet troops to prevent these revolutions. He chose not to. Partly this was because he'd promised not to interfere. Partly it was because military intervention would destroy his relationships with the West and end any possibility of economic aid. Partly it was because he believed that reformed communism could still work, and that forcing Eastern Europeans to stay communist at gunpoint was both immoral and unsustainable. He was right about the last part, but his faith in reformed communism was misplaced. German reunification followed the fall of the Berlin Wall with startling speed. East and West Germany had been separate states for 40 years, and reunification was supposed to be a complex process taking years or decades. Instead, it took less than a year. The East German state essentially dissolved as its population left or demanded integration with West Germany. The reunification treaty was signed in August 1990, and on October 3, 1990, Germany was reunified. The Soviet Union, which had suffered enormously from German invasion and had created East Germany as a buffer zone, agreed to reunification in exchange for economic aid and guarantees about NATO expansion. Gorbachev got the aid, but the guarantees about NATO proved less durable than he'd hoped. If the Soviet Union couldn't maintain control over its allies, could it maintain control over its own territory? This concern would prove prescient. Within the Soviet Union, Gorbachev's reforms were creating chaos. The economy was contracting. Shortages were worsening. Inflation was increasing. The half-reformed economic system worked worse than the unreformed system had, because you'd removed central planning's coordination without replacing it with market mechanisms. Lines for basic goods grew longer. Store shelves emptied. Rationing was reintroduced for some products. The social contract, we accept lack of freedom in exchange for economic security, was breaking down because the economic security was disappearing. Political opposition emerged openly for the first time in Soviet history. Democratic reform movements formed, calling for multi-party elections and constitutional reform. The Communist Party's monopoly on power was abolished in 1990, allowing opposition parties to organize legally. The Congress of People's Deputies, created as part of Gorbachev's political reforms, became a forum for genuine debate rather than rubber-stamping party decisions. But this political opening happened while the economy was collapsing, and while nationalist movements in the republics were demanding independence. The Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, led the independence movements. They'd been independent countries before Soviet annexation in 1940, and they'd never accepted Soviet rule as legitimate. In 1989 and 1990, they began declaring sovereignty and moving toward independence. He'd lost other Ukraine, the Union, the federal structure that was supposed to manage the multinational empire while maintaining central control, was instead providing the framework for the empire's dissolution. Boris Yeltsin emerged as Gorbachev's rival and eventually his nemesis. Yeltsin was a Communist Party member who'd served as Moscow Party boss, but had clashed with Gorbachev over the pace of reform. Yeltsin wanted faster and more radical changes. He'd been removed from the Moscow position and humiliated, but he'd used the new democratic institutions to stage a comeback. In 1990, he was elected chairman of the Russian parliament. In June 1991, he won election as president of the Russian Federation, the first freely elected leader in Russian history. Yeltsin's position was both powerful and paradoxical. He led the Russian Federation, which was part of the Soviet Union but was also by far the largest and most important republic. He had democratic legitimacy from winning an election, while Gorbachev had been appointed by the Communist Party. Yeltsin supported faster reforms, while Gorbachev tried to preserve the Soviet system in reformed versions. The conflict between Yeltsin and Gorbachev reflected the larger conflict about whether to reform the Soviet system or replace it entirely. By mid-1991, the Soviet Union was in terminal crisis. The economy was collapsing. Republics were declaring independence. The Communist Party was discredited and divided. Gorbachev was negotiating a new union treaty that would give republics more autonomy while preserving some form of union, but it was unclear whether this would satisfy anyone. Hardliners in the party and military thought Gorbachev had given away too much and destroyed the Soviet Union through his reforms. Reformers thought he hadn't gone far enough and was trying to preserve a system that couldn't be saved. The August Putsch of 1991 was a last-ditch attempt by Soviet hardliners to save the USSR. On August 19th, while Gorbachev was vacationing in Crimea, a group of senior officials, including the Vice President, Prime Minister, Defense Minister, and KGB Chairman, announced that Gorbachev was ill and they were taking power as an emergency committee. The goal was to reverse Gorbachev's reforms and restore Soviet power. The coup failed for several reasons. Gorbachev refused to cooperate or resign, even while under house arrest. Yeltsin, in Moscow, rallied opposition to the coup, famously standing on a tank outside the Russian parliament building and calling for resistance. Most importantly, the coup leaders were indecisive. They didn't arrest Yeltsin when they had the chance. They didn't shut down communications. They didn't use overwhelming force. They acted like Soviet bureaucrats trying to follow proper procedure, rather than like conspirators trying to seize power, which was admirably civilized but ineffective for staging coups. After 3 days, the coup collapsed. The emergency committee members fled or were arrested. Gorbachev returned to Moscow, but he was returning to a different country. The coup had discredited the Communist Party and Soviet institutions. Yeltsin had demonstrated that he, not Gorbachev, had the political authority and popular support. The republics accelerated their independence declarations, recognizing that the Soviet center was too weak to stop them. The Communist Party was banned in Russia and effectively dissolved in other republics. Gorbachev resigned as general secretary of a party that no longer existed. The Soviet Union itself was dissolving. Gorbachev tried to negotiate some form of commonwealth to preserve economic ties, but most republics wanted complete independence. On December 8, 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine and Belarus met in the Belovezhskaya forest and signed the Belovezh Accords, declaring that the Soviet Union had ceased to exist and creating the Commonwealth of Independent States as a loose association of former Soviet republics. This was legally questionable. It wasn't clear that 3 republic leaders had the authority to dissolve the entire Union, but it was politically realistic. The Soviet Union was dead whether or not it was officially dissolved. Gorbachev resisted at first, arguing that the Union could be preserved in some form, but he had no power base left. The republics were ignoring Soviet authority. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev delivered a televised resignation speech as president of the Soviet Union. He lowered the Soviet flag over the Kremlin for the last time. The Russian tricolour was raised in its place. The collapse was remarkably peaceful, all things considered. There was violence in some regions, particularly in the Caucasus, where ethnic conflicts had been suppressed but not resolved. But there was no civil war, no military conflict between republics, no use of nuclear weapons, no intervention by foreign powers. The largest empire in the world dissolved with less violence than many far smaller political transitions. 15 independent countries emerged from the Soviet Union: Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. They inherited portions of Soviet infrastructure, resources, military equipment, and about 280 million people who'd been Soviet citizens and now had to figure out how to live in post-Soviet states. The Russian Federation inherited the Soviet Union's seat on the UN Security Council, nuclear weapons, and debts. The other republics inherited varying degrees of economic development, environmental damage, and political challenges. For Gorbachev, the collapse was a tragedy. He'd tried to reform the Soviet system to make it work better, and had instead dissolved it entirely. He'd tried to maintain the Union while allowing more freedom, and had instead unleashed forces that tore the Union apart. He'd tried to make socialism with a human face, and had instead demonstrated that the whole system was unsustainable. His place in history is complicated. He's credited with ending the Cold War peacefully, and blamed for destroying the Soviet Union. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1990 for his foreign policy achievements, and was deeply unpopular in Russia for presiding over the collapse of the state. Gorbachev genuinely believed in socialism and tried to save it through reform. His tragedy was that the reforms necessary to make the system minimally functional were also sufficient to destroy it. Once you allowed glasnost, people discovered how much they'd been lied to and lost faith in the system. Once you allowed perestroika, the economic contradictions of central planning became impossible to hide. Once you allowed national self-determination, the republics chose independence over remaining in the Union. The fundamental problems, economic inefficiency, political repression, nationalist tensions, technological backwardness, would have persisted and worsened. Gorbachev tried to solve these problems through reform and discovered that they were unsolvable within the Soviet framework. The Soviet experiment lasted 69 years, from 1922 to 1991. Whether you view the Soviet Union as a noble experiment that failed, or as a totalitarian nightmare that finally ended, depends largely on which aspects of its history you emphasize. What's clear is that the collapse was the result of accumulated failures and contradictions that Gorbachev's reforms exposed but didn't create. The Soviet system had been failing slowly for decades. Gorbachev's attempt to fix it accelerated the failure by removing the mechanisms, censorship, repression, central control that had been holding the system together. His reforms were like removing scaffolding from a building and discovering that the building couldn't stand on its own. The scaffolding had been holding up a structure that was fundamentally unsound. The post-Soviet transition would be turbulent for all 15 successor states. Ukraine would struggle to establish democracy and independence while dealing with Russian interference. The legacies of Soviet rule, economic distortion, environmental damage, political culture, security services, corruption would persist for decades. The Soviet collapse reshaped the world. The Cold War ended. The United States emerged as the sole superpower. Democracy and market economics seemed triumphant. The end of history was proclaimed. This optimism would prove premature. The post-Cold War world would bring new conflicts, new authoritarian regimes, and new challenges that demonstrated that history hadn't ended, but had just entered a new phase. But in 1991, the dominant emotion was relief that the Cold War had ended without nuclear war, and that the Soviet experiment, with all its costs and failures, was finally over. 70 years after Lenin and Stalin created the USSR from the ruins of the Russian Empire, the experiment concluded. The attempt to build socialism through central planning and one-party rule had failed. The attempt to create a new Soviet man who'd transcend nationalism and class interests had failed. The attempt to prove that a command economy could outperform market economies had failed. What remained were memories, some nostalgia for Soviet achievements and stability, more often relief that the system was gone, and the ongoing challenge of building something better on the ruins of what had collapsed. So that's the story of the Soviet Union. 69 years of one of the most ambitious, brutal, contradictory, and ultimately failed experiments in human history. From the revolutionary optimism of 1922 to the exhausted dissolution of 1991, the USSR tried to prove that central planning could outperform markets, that one-party rule could be more effective than democracy, that nationalism could be transcended through socialist ideology, and that a completely new type of society could be built through willpower and violence. The experiment failed on essentially all counts, but the scale of the attempt and the consequences of that failure shaped the 20th century and continue to influence the 21st. Assessing the Soviet legacy is complicated because it depends enormously on what you're measuring and whose perspective you're taking. If you're measuring industrial output, the Soviet Union achieved massive increases, transforming a largely agricultural economy into an industrial power in a few decades. If you're measuring military power, the USSR became a superpower that defeated Nazi Germany and competed with the United States for global influence. If you're measuring quality of life, Soviet citizens lived with chronic shortages, political repression, and standards of living well below Western countries despite comparable or greater natural resources. The Soviet Union's greatest achievement was probably surviving and winning World War II. Nazi Germany intended to exterminate or enslave the Soviet population and colonize Soviet territory. The fact that this didn't happen, that Nazi Germany was instead destroyed and its territories occupied, represents a genuine historic accomplishment. Soviet industrial capacity, built through the brutal forced industrialization of the 1930s, provided the weapons necessary to fight. Soviet citizens, despite everything Stalin's regime had done to them, fought with desperate courage to defend their homeland. The victory over Nazi Germany became central to Soviet and post-Soviet identity. Victory Day, May 9th, remains the most important holiday in Russia and many other former Soviet states. It represents the moment when Soviet suffering was redeemed by triumph, when the system's claims to legitimacy seemed validated by survival against existential threat. The memory of the Great Patriotic War outlasted the Soviet Union itself and continues to shape how Russians view their history and their place in the world. The problem with this memory is that it's selective. It celebrates the victory while minimizing the ways Stalin's policies made the war more costly than it needed to be. How his purges weakened the military, how his diplomacy failed to prevent the war, how his terror continued even during the war against people deemed insufficiently loyal. When the Bolsheviks took power, Russia was overwhelmingly agricultural and economically backward compared to Western Europe. By the 1950s, the Soviet Union was an industrial power with significant manufacturing capacity, scientific capabilities, and technological achievements including nuclear weapons and spaceflight. This transformation happened faster than the industrialization of most other countries, though the speed was achieved through methods: forced labor, resource extraction without concern for efficiency or environment, central planning that prioritized heavy industry over consumer welfare, that created long-term problems even while achieving short-term goals. Soviet scientific and technological achievements were real. The space program put the first satellite and first human in orbit. Soviet mathematicians and computer scientists made genuine contributions to their fields. These achievements demonstrated that the Soviet system could mobilize intellectual resources and coordinate large-scale projects, at least in areas the leadership prioritized. The problem was that prioritization, resources went to military applications, space and prestige projects, while consumer technology, medical infrastructure for ordinary citizens, and environmental protection were neglected. The Soviet Union achieved nearly universal literacy, something the Russian Empire had never accomplished. Schools were built across the country. Universities trained scientists, engineers, doctors, and teachers. Women had access to education and professional careers at rates exceeding many Western countries during the early Soviet period. The education was heavily ideological. Students learned Marxism, Leninism alongside mathematics and literature. But the basic educational infrastructure was a real achievement that benefited millions of people who would never have had educational opportunities under the old regime. Gender equality in the Soviet Union was complex and contradictory. Women had legal equality, worked in most professions, and had access to education and careers. Soviet propaganda celebrated women workers, women scientists, women cosmonauts. The reality was more complicated. Women still did most domestic labor, faced discrimination in advancement to top positions, and were concentrated in lower-paying sectors. But Soviet women did have more opportunities than their mothers and grandmothers had under the